Welcome to In the Shadows. I'm Jack, and tonight's show brings you scary stories to fall asleep. A black screen, the sound of rain, and no ads. Just you, the darkness, and the stories. As you settle in, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is. It fascinates me to think of all of you scattered across the world listening tonight. So leave a comment if you can, and if you enjoy this quiet escape, don't forget to like and subscribe. There will be no interruptions. Now let's begin. It was raining the day we moved into the house. A heavy downpour that soaked through our boxes and left muddy tracks on the hardwood floors as we hurried inside. The realtor hadn't mentioned the rain, but she also hadn't mentioned much else about the house other than its history. That's realtor talk for no one else wanted to live here. Honestly, though, the price was right, and the neighborhood seemed decent. At least, from what we could see through the fogged-up car windows. My wife, Emily, was already barking orders, telling me to this box upstairs, put that one in the kitchen, watch out for the puddles on the floor. Our teenage daughter, Hannah, stood in the entryway, scrolling on her phone and looking thoroughly unimpressed. She barely glanced up as I lugged the last of the boxes inside. I couldn't blame her, really. The place wasn't exactly a dream home, but it was ours. Our 8-year-old son, Ben, was the only one excited. He raced through the house, his sneakers squeaking on the wet floor, exploring every corner. I could hear him upstairs, shouting out each discovery. "Dad, there's a weird old door up here. Mom, look at this cool window." I smiled. At least someone liked it. As the day went on, the rain continued. It was the kind of steady, relentless rain that blurred everything outside, making the house feel isolated, like we were the only people left in the world. By evening, we were unpacked enough to relax. Emily made some pasta, and we sat down for our first meal in the new place. The house was quiet, save for the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. Hannah, still glued to her phone, suddenly broke the silence. "You know this house is supposed to be haunted, right?" she said casually, not looking up. I laughed. "Yeah? Who told you that?" "Some girl at school," she replied, twirling her fork around in the pasta. I shrugged it off. "Ghosts don't pay the mortgage, so I'm not worried." Emily chuckled and Ben looked at us wide-eyed. "Really? Haunted?" he asked. "Don't scare your brother," Emily said, shaking her head. Hannah shrugged again and went back to her phone. It was just a story, something to tell around the lunch table. That's what I told myself anyway. The rain hadn't stopped by the next morning. It was one of those autumn storms that just wouldn't quit, soaking the earth for days at a time. Emily had already left for work, and I was unpacking some of the last boxes when I noticed something odd. One of the kitchen cabinets was open. Not a big deal, right? I probably forgot to close it. But when I reached up to shut it, I realized it wasn't just one. All of the cabinets were slightly ajar. I paused for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. Ben was at school, and Hannah was upstairs in her room. I hadn't touched any of the cabinets that morning. I closed them all with a click. Later that afternoon, I heard footsteps overhead. Hannah was in her room, or so I thought. But when I called up to ask if she needed anything, there was no answer. I went upstairs to check on her. Her door was wide open, her bed neatly made, but she wasn't there. I called her name again, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, right above me. But we didn't have an attic. I stood there, listening. The rain outside seemed louder, the sound of the droplets magnified in the silence of the house. I turned and walked back downstairs, trying to brush off the creeping sense that something wasn't quite right. Later that evening, Emily came home, exhausted from her day at work. We were sitting in the living room when Hannah finally came down from her room. "I was hearing weird noises upstairs," she said nonchalantly, sitting on the couch beside Emily. I didn't want to admit that I had heard them too. "Old house," I said. "They make noise." She didn't look convinced, neither was I. It was late, close to midnight. I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the rain that still hadn't stopped. Emily was already asleep beside me, her soft breathing the only sound in the room. Suddenly, there was a noise from the hallway. A faint creak, like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I sat up. For a second, I considered ignoring it, but then it came again, louder this time, closer to our bedroom door. I got up and quietly opened the door, peeking into the dark hallway. Nothing. I stepped into the hallway, listening. Then I heard it again, this time coming from inside the walls. It wasn't an animal, I knew that much. The noise was deliberate, slow. I followed it, moving down the hallway, my feet sinking into the carpet as I went. The sound stopped suddenly, as if whatever, or whoever, had been there realized I was listening. I stood in the hallway for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as I was about to turn back, there was a sharp knock at the front door. I practically jumped out of my skin. I walked downstairs, half expecting to see no one there. But when I opened the door, I found a man standing on our front porch, drenched from the rain. He had a scruffy beard, wild eyes, and a tattered coat that looked like it had seen better days. "You need help?" I asked, my voice strained. He didn't answer right away. Just stared at me for a moment like he was sizing me up. Then, finally, he spoke. "Just passing through," he said, his voice rough, almost a growl. He gave me a crooked smile, turned and disappeared into the rain. I stood there, staring after him. Something about him made me feel uneasy, like he knew something I didn't. The footsteps, the whispers, the strange sounds in the walls, they were getting worse. It was nearly every night now. Emily had started to notice too, but she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. We both knew something was wrong. Then one night, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the basement, determined to find the source of the noise once and for all. The air was damp, the concrete floor cold under my feet. The basement was cluttered with boxes, most of which we hadn't even unpacked yet. I moved carefully, listening for any sound, any movement. And then I saw it. A small, barely noticeable gap in the wall, just behind the furnace. I crouched down, shining the flashlight into the gap. It was too small for an animal to fit through, but just large enough for something else. I reached out, my fingers brushing the edges of the gap. And then suddenly, a hand shot out from the darkness and grabbed my wrist. I yanked my hand back, scrambling to my feet. The flashlight clattered to the floor. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I saw him, the same man who had knocked on our door. He was crouched in the corner, his clothes filthy, his eyes wild. "You're not supposed to be here," he hissed. I stumbled back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. He had been living in our walls. For how long, I had no idea. The police came quickly after I called them. They found the man still in the basement, hiding behind the furnace. He had been squatting in the house for months, maybe even years. He'd carved out small spaces in the walls where he could move through the house unnoticed. They found a stash of food, clothes, even some of our missing items tucked away in one of his hideouts. It was all over the news the next day. A deranged squatter terrorizing a family in their own home. The reporters wanted to know how we hadn't noticed him sooner. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that, for weeks, we'd lived with the belief that something supernatural was haunting us. In reality, it was far worse. A real, living person. After the man was arrested, we packed up and left the house, moved to a new place, far away from that nightmare. But even now, whenever I hear a creak in the floorboards or a whisper in the night, I can't help but wonder, is it really just the house settling, or is there someone else watching, waiting? It was raining when I stepped into the shop. The small bell over the door jangled as I entered, cutting through the quiet gloom inside. I hadn't meant to stop here, but the rain had come down hard, and I didn't have an umbrella. The shop was one of those cramped places packed with strange old trinkets, the kind you only find when you're not looking for anything at all. The smell of dust and damp wood hung in the air. A long counter ran along one wall, cluttered with objects, odd silverware, cracked porcelain, old clocks that hadn't worked in years. But it wasn't any of that that caught my eye. It was the box, sitting on the top shelf, half hidden behind a stack of ancient books. It was old, wooden, and intricately carved with strange symbols that seemed to twist and curl into each other. It had a small brass lock on the front, dull with age. I don't know why I asked about it, but before I knew it, I was pointing at it, asking the shopkeeper how much it cost. He appeared from the back of the shop, wiping his hands on an old rag. A thin man, pale, with eyes that seemed too bright for the dim lighting. "That one?" he said, following my gaze. His lips curled into a strange smile, a bit too wide. "It's cursed, you know," he added. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he didn't. His smile stayed fixed, unchanging. "Cursed how?" I asked, my voice coming out lighter than I intended. He didn't answer right away, just stared at me with that same smile, then said, "You'll regret it if you take it home." I didn't believe in curses, never had. I thought it was just a sales tactic, something to make the item seem more interesting. But something about the way he said it, that smile, lingered in my mind. Still, I bought the box. As I left, I could feel his eyes on me, watching me walk out into the rain. I put the box on a shelf in my living room when I got home. For a few days, it just sat there, untouched, like any other piece of my collection. I didn't even think about it much, but then strange things started happening. At first it was small, almost easy to dismiss. I would come home from work and notice the box had shifted ever so slightly. It was never where I had left it, not exactly. I told myself I must have moved it without thinking. But it kept happening. Then the lights in the living room began flickering whenever I was near it. Again, I blamed it on something rational, old wiring, maybe a bad bulb. But the flickering only seemed to happen when I was close to the box. It got worse when I tried to open it. One night, I decided to see what was inside. The brass lock was fragile, more decorative than functional, and it clicked open easily. But when I lifted the lid, the lights went out completely. I sat there in the dark, holding the box, the air thick with silence. When the lights finally flickered back on, I shut the box and shoved it back onto the shelf. Something wasn't right. I couldn't stop thinking about the shopkeeper's smile, the way he'd said I'd regret it. By the third week, I was convinced something was wrong with the box. Things around my apartment started to feel off. Doors that I knew I had closed were suddenly open. My keys, which I always left by the door, would be in strange places, once in the fridge, another time under my pillow. The tapping started after that. Late at night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I'd hear it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the living room. It was always slow, deliberate, like someone knocking softly on wood. I'd lie there in bed, listening, telling myself it was just the old pipes, the floorboards settling. But every time I got up to check, the box was sitting there, still and silent. Closed, but somehow watching. I called the shop. No answer. I went back to the shop the next day, but it was closed. The windows were dark, the door locked, a simple "closed for business" sign hanging on the glass. I stood there for a long time, staring at that sign, feeling a strange unease creeping into my bones. That night, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and marched into the living room. The box sat on the shelf, exactly where I'd left it. But this time, the lid was slightly ajar. I hadn't opened it. I was sure of it. I grabbed it off the shelf and stormed out of the apartment into the rain. I had to get rid of it. But as I stood outside, holding the box under the downpour, something stopped me. I looked down at the carved symbols, the worn wood, and felt something tugging at the back of my mind. A memory. Something I'd forgotten. I went back inside, dripping wet, the box still clutched in my hands. I called the shop again, and this time someone picked up. It was the shopkeeper. He didn't say anything at first, just waited for me to speak. "I need to return the box," I said. His response was a low chuckle, cold and deliberate. "You finally figured it out, huh?" he said. The memory hit me then. I had been to the shop before, years ago, during a rough time in my life. I had said something to the shopkeeper, something careless, a rude comment I barely remembered. But he remembered, and now he was getting his revenge. The police didn't believe me. I tried explaining everything, the box, the shopkeeper, the strange occurrences, but they looked at me like I was crazy. They went to the shop, of course, but it was empty. The shopkeeper was gone, the building abandoned, no records, no trace of him. I threw the box away after that, dumped it in a landfill miles from the city. But things didn't feel normal. Even without the box, my apartment still felt wrong. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and swear I heard that same tapping. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shopkeeper was still watching me, still waiting for something. Weeks passed and the tapping stopped. But every now and then, when it was quiet, when I was alone in the apartment, I'd catch a glimpse of something from the corner of my eye. A shadow shifting, something moving just out of sight. And I'd remember that cold chuckle, the way he said, "You'll regret it." I never told anyone else what happened, not fully. Who would believe me anyway? When I moved into Maplewood, it was early fall. The air was crisp, cool enough for jackets, but not too cold to keep the windows open. I was excited for a fresh start. After years in the city, I craved a slower pace, quieter nights, no more car alarms at 2 a.m. Maplewood felt like the right fit. Everyone was friendly, that kind of small-town charm you read about in novels. There was only one neighbor who stood out, Mrs. Barrows. She lived next door. Her house older than the others, shutters always closed, even on sunny days. From the moment I saw her, I got a strange feeling about her. She never waved like the others. She didn't say hello when I moved in, just sat on her porch in her old wicker chair, watching. It was a gray day when I first saw her properly, overcast, with light rain falling. I had been unpacking boxes when I caught sight of her. She was just sitting there, still as a statue, staring. I looked up, hoping she'd wave or smile, some kind of acknowledgement. Nothing. She just sat there, her thin gray hair pulled back tight, eyes hidden under a wide-brimmed black hat. Something about the way she watched made my skin crawl. That night, when I went to take out the trash, I noticed something strange. Symbols drawn in the dirt by my front door. I bent down, squinting through the rain to get a closer look. Circles, lines, shapes I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was kids playing a prank, but when I looked up, her porch light flicked on, illuminating Mrs. Barrows still sitting there, watching. I quickly went back inside, feeling unsettled. It was just the rain, I told myself. Just the rain. The next few weeks were strange. It started small. My garden, which had been doing fine, suddenly died. Overnight, the flowers wilted, the leaves turning black. I didn't know what to think. Maybe bad soil? Too much rain? But then the animals started showing up. First, it was a bird on the lawn, then a squirrel, then another bird. Each one dead, always found near my house. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to sound crazy, but it was Mrs. Barrows. I knew it had something to do with her. Every time I saw her, she was just sitting on her porch, watching, never speaking. One evening, just after dusk, I saw her backyard for the first time. The old wooden fence had gaps where the boards had fallen. I glanced through, just a quick look. There were candles, lit in a circle, flickering against the backdrop of the night. And in the center, something was moving. I couldn't see clearly, but it looked like a shadow, slow, deliberate movements. I stepped back, quickly walking inside, unsure of what I'd just seen. That night I heard strange noises. Low whispers carried through the rain, words I couldn't understand. I looked out the window, but her house was dark. Still, I knew something was happening over there. I decided to confront her the next morning. When I approached her house, my heart pounded in my chest. I knocked on the door, waited, knocked again, nothing. I walked around to the porch where she always sat. There she was, staring off into the distance as if I wasn't even there. "Mrs. Barrows?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. She turned her head slowly, eyes dark and unreadable. "Is something wrong?" I pressed, feeling stupid for even asking. She didn't answer right away, just mumbled something under her breath. I leaned in, trying to catch the words. "All will be protected," she muttered, her voice barely audible. I stepped back, not sure what she meant, her words rattling in my mind. It was a rainy night when everything came to a head. I woke up to an acrid smell, like burning. I ran to the window, thick smoke rising from somewhere outside. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed out the back door. The smoke was coming from Mrs. Barrow's yard. I pushed open the gate and stepped into her backyard. The candles were there again, but this time they were nearly burned out. In the center of the circle was a small fire, smoldering. Through the smoke I saw something else, something that made me stop cold. A figure, cloaked in black, standing near the fire. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if performing some kind of ritual. I didn't want to believe it, but everything pointed to it. She was a witch. I took a step forward, my flashlight flickering in the rain. That's when I noticed it. On the ground near the fire, a trapdoor. I hadn't seen it before. Something was moving down there, beneath the ground. I felt a chill sweep over me, and I stepped back. I had seen enough. I needed to get out, now. I called the police the next morning, told them everything, the symbols, the animals, the fire in her yard. At first they didn't take me seriously, but when they arrived and searched her property, things took a dark turn. They found the trapdoor in her yard. What was underneath wasn't a cellar or storage. It was a room, small, hidden, and horrifying. Inside they found evidence of something far worse than witchcraft. People had been kept there, locked away. Mrs. Barrows had been using the guise of dark rituals to keep people from asking questions. The symbols, the dead animals, all just a distraction from the real horror. She was part of something far more sinister, a trafficking ring, right under everyone's nose. I couldn't believe it. The whole time, she had been hiding something much darker than any spell. The police arrested her, and soon the whole neighborhood knew the truth. Even after Mrs. Barrows was gone, a sense of unease lingered. Her house sat empty for months. I tried to forget about it, to move on, but it wasn't that simple. Every time I passed her house, I couldn't help but look at that porch, expecting to see her sitting there again. The symbols had been cleaned away. The backyard returned to normal, but I knew better. What she had been doing was still in my mind. The horror of it all. I still think about that night sometimes. The fire, the trapdoor, the figure moving in the smoke. And I wonder, was she really just using the witchcraft as a front, or did she believe it herself? Sometimes late at night, I still hear whispers in the wind, and when it rains, I stay inside, just in case. We were all craving a break from the everyday grind, so when Mark suggested a camping trip in the woods, it felt like a perfect escape. Sarah and I didn't need much convincing, and Claire, always the adventurer, jumped at the idea. We packed up the car and headed out on a rainy Friday afternoon, the kind of slow, steady drizzle that clings to your windshield no matter how fast the wipers go. The forest we chose was well known in the area for its hiking trails, but it also carried a reputation for strange local legends. Rumors of cults and bizarre rituals performed deep in the woods were nothing new, but we brushed them off as small-town folklore. We weren't there for ghost stories, after all. The drive was long, and as the rain picked up, the road grew slick, the tires splashing through muddy patches along the way. By the time we reached the edge of the forest, it was nearly dusk, and the rain had only intensified, soaking the ground beneath our feet. A park ranger waved us over as we pulled into the lot. He was an older guy, worn down from years of patrolling the woods, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You folks staying out here tonight?" he asked, eyeing the sky like he expected the weather to get worse. We nodded, and Mark flashed a smile, always the smooth talker. "Yeah, just for the weekend. We've been cooped up for too long." The ranger didn't smile back. "Stick to the marked trails, and don't go wandering too far. There've been some incidents." He didn't elaborate, and we didn't ask. It was just enough to plant that first seed of doubt, though we didn't realize it at the time. After we set up camp, the rain let up slightly, but the dampness hung in the air, making everything feel heavy and cold. Claire spotted strange symbols carved into a nearby tree as we gathered around the fire, laughing it off as graffiti from other campers. Still, it stuck with me, those symbols, like they didn't belong there. But by nightfall, we were too busy roasting marshmallows and telling stories to care about the trees or the ranger's warnings. We were here to relax, and for the first night, we did. The rain started up again the next morning, light at first but steady, a constant reminder of how far from home we were. We hiked for a while, exploring the deeper parts of the forest, following a narrow, winding path that seemed to disappear into the trees. The farther we went, the more we noticed those strange carvings on the trees. Fresh, like someone had been out here recently, marking the forest with symbols we didn't recognize. Mark joked that we were walking into some kind of horror movie scenario, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here, even though we hadn't seen another soul since we'd arrived. And then, just as we were debating whether to keep going or head back, Mark stopped dead in his tracks. He was staring at something, squinting through the rain. "Do you see that?" he asked quietly, pointing through the trees. I followed his gaze but saw nothing but rain and shadows. Sarah laughed, brushing him off. "Maybe it's Bigfoot, or one of those cult members the ranger warned us about." She was trying to lighten the mood, but none of us laughed. The woods felt different now, darker, even though it was still the middle of the day. We turned back, deciding we'd had enough hiking for one afternoon, and made our way back to camp in silence. That night, the chanting started. At first it was distant, almost too faint to make out, but there was no mistaking it. A rhythmic sound, like voices rising and falling in unison, somewhere deep in the forest. Mark wanted to investigate, but Claire and I insisted we stay put. We weren't going to risk getting lost out there, not in the dark, and not with those weird symbols on every other tree. We convinced ourselves it was just another group of campers, maybe having a little too much fun. But part of me knew, even then, that something was off. The rain fell harder on the third night, drumming against our tents, drowning out everything but our own thoughts. That's probably why it took me so long to notice Claire wasn't in her tent. I unzipped my sleeping bag and peeked outside, expecting to see her by the fire, maybe getting some fresh air. But she was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at something in the trees. I called her name, but she didn't respond, just stood there like she was in a trance. Sarah and Mark joined me, and we all followed her gaze into the forest. That's when we saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the rain, a group of hooded figures surrounded a fire, swaying and chanting in time with the rising wind. At the center of the circle was something, or someone, lying motionless on the ground. A figure raised a knife above their head, their face obscured by the hood. I didn't wait to see what happened next. We backed away, too shocked to speak, knowing we had stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see. As we turned to leave, Mark stepped on a branch, the sharp crack breaking the rhythm of the chanting. The figures stopped. One of them turned, looking directly at us. We ran. We barely made it back to camp, drenched and out of breath, every shadow in the trees now a threat. We needed to leave, but when we got to the car, we found all 4 tires slashed. Someone didn't want us leaving. With no cell service, no way to call for help, we had no choice but to stay hidden until morning. We huddled together, the rain still pouring, too afraid to move. As the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, we emerged from our hiding spot, careful to avoid the trees where we had seen the figures. That's when Nick realized what we had actually witnessed. The cult wasn't a cult at all. It was something much worse. One of the hooded figures looked familiar, like someone from a missing person poster we'd seen in town. The truth was far more terrifying than any ritual. We hadn't seen a ceremony. We had stumbled upon a group of killers, using the rumors of cult activity in the woods to cover their crimes. We were lucky to get out of those woods. A passing hiker found us wandering along the trail, dazed and soaked from the rain. We reported everything to the authorities, but without any physical evidence, they were skeptical at best. The altar, the symbols, even the clearing we had seen, all of it was gone by the time they went to investigate. It was like they had never been there. And maybe that's what scared me the most. Whoever they were still out there, hiding behind the legends, waiting for their next victim. We returned to our normal lives, but none of us were the same. Mark moved away not long after, unable to shake the feeling that they were still watching us. Sarah and Claire stopped talking about the trip altogether. like pretending it didn't happen could erase it from their minds. But me, I still hear the chanting sometimes, late at night, when the rain is heavy and the wind blows just right, and I wonder if one day they'll come for me too. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to lose track of time like that. It was a Thursday, just like any other. I'd gone to bed around midnight, nothing out of the ordinary. But I woke up in a completely different place. Outside, standing in the middle of an empty street. It was early morning, still dark, with rain pouring down around me. The sound of the rain hitting the pavement was the only thing that seemed real. I had no idea how I got there. My clothes were soaked, and I was wearing shoes I didn't recognize. I stood there for a while, trying to piece it together, but nothing came to mind. I was in a part of town I never visited, nowhere near my apartment. I walked for what felt like hours, finally making my way back home. When I stepped inside, everything felt wrong. The furniture had been moved around. Not a lot, just small things like the coffee table shifted, the lamp at an odd angle. I couldn't remember doing any of it. I started to wonder if I was losing it, but then again, things like this had been happening for weeks. It started small, misplacing my keys, waking up with scratches on my arms, finding my front door unlocked. Each time, I'd chalk it up to being tired or stressed. But this was something else entirely. That day, I started keeping track of everything, writing down what time I went to sleep, where I left things in my apartment. I figured maybe if I could just keep a closer eye on things, it would stop. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. The blackouts became more frequent. It wasn't just happening at night anymore. I'd be in the middle of a conversation with someone or watching TV, and then suddenly, I'd blink and hours would be gone. One afternoon, I woke up on my couch, my hands covered in dirt. There was a trail of muddy footprints leading from my front door to where I was sitting. I hadn't been outside. I couldn't explain it. I'd even started recording myself while I slept, hoping to catch something. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe I was sleepwalking, maybe it was something else. One night I played back the footage and watched myself sit straight up in bed, eyes wide open. I was speaking, but it wasn't my voice. It was low, guttural, like something else entirely. I couldn't understand the words, but they felt ancient. I watched in shock as I got out of bed, walked around the room, and then just stood there, facing the wall, for what felt like an eternity. The camera ran out of battery before I moved again. After that, I couldn't sleep. I started thinking about possession, about demons. It wasn't like me to believe in that sort of thing, but what else could it be? I was terrified of what would happen next. Every night, I'd sit up in bed, waiting for something to take control of me. But the worst part was, I knew it would. I woke up in the middle of the night, standing in the pouring rain again. This time, I was in a park miles away from my apartment. I had no memory of leaving. My clothes were wet, my hands filthy, and there was a strange smell lingering around me. I started walking back home, my mind blank, but my body moving on its own. When I got there, the door was wide open. Inside, everything was wrong. The pictures on the walls had been taken down and they were scattered across the floor. Pages from books were torn and thrown everywhere. My phone was missing. I was losing control and fast. I ran out, desperate for help, and found myself at the steps of a church. I don't even remember how I got there, but I was standing in front of the priest, begging him to help me. I told him everything. The blackouts, the strange voice, the things I'd been doing without remembering. He looked at me for a long time and finally said, "You don't need an exorcism. You need to see a doctor." It was like he knew something I didn't. I left, confused and frustrated, but deep down I started to wonder if he was right. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew I couldn't keep ignoring the truth. The next day I went to a psychiatrist. I laid it all out for her. The blackouts, the voice, the strange behavior. She didn't flinch. Instead, she asked about my childhood. I hadn't thought about that in years. I tried to brush it off, but she pushed. And then it started coming back, little pieces at first. My dad, He used to tell me that I was cursed, that if I didn't behave, something inside me would take over. I was young, maybe 7 or 8, and I believed him. He made me sit through rituals, saying prayers in languages I didn't understand. He told me I had to, or else the demon would win. I never questioned him back then. I never realized how much it messed me up, but the psychiatrist did. She told me I wasn't possessed. I had dissociative identity disorder, something brought on by the trauma of those childhood experiences. My mind had created another version of me to deal with it. The blackouts, the strange behavior, that was the other me, the one I'd been trying to suppress for years. Months passed, and I tried to adjust. Therapy helped, but I still felt like there was something off. I hadn't had a blackout since I started treatment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the other part of me was still there. Waiting. It's strange, knowing that the thing I thought was a demon was really just another version of myself. But it doesn't make it any less terrifying. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I can feel it creeping back in. I'll find myself staring into the mirror, half expecting to see a different face looking back at me. The whispers haven't stopped either. They're quieter now, but they're still there, lurking in the background. I try to remind myself that it's just a trick of my mind, a symptom of the disorder. But it's hard to believe that when it feels so real. I've learned to live with it for the most part, but I don't know if I'll ever be fully free. Part of me wonders if that darker side of me is waiting for the right moment to come back. And when it does, I don't know if I'll be strong enough to stop it. It all started with a funeral, as these things often do. I was sitting in the back row, staring blankly at the coffin as the priest droned on about life and death. My uncle had been found at the bottom of his stairs, neck broken, blood pooling beneath him like a morbid puddle. Everyone said it was an accident, just a tragic slip, but something didn't sit right with me. Then again, nothing ever felt right with my family. Not since my father's sudden heart attack years ago. The deaths kept happening, one after another, each time a different family member, each time with an excuse that seemed plausible enough. But there was always this nagging feeling that something else was at play, something darker. At the time, I brushed it off as my imagination running wild. Grief does strange things to you. Still, the whispers about a curse had been floating around for as long as I could remember. It was something the older relatives joked about in hushed tones at holiday dinners after a few too many drinks. When my mother drowned last year, I began to wonder if there was something to it. She had been a good swimmer her whole life, but they said she slipped on wet rocks by the river. A freak accident, they called it, just like my father's heart attack, just like Uncle Fred's fall. I didn't buy it, but I had no proof. No one else seemed to think much of it. Except for Richard. Richard, the cousin who always showed up when someone died, who always had the right words but never stayed too long. There was something off about him. He didn't look particularly upset during any of these funerals, but no one else seemed to notice. I chalked it up to his personality, distant, unemotional, not close to anyone in the family. But now, as I sat in that pew, staring at the coffin, the idea of a curse didn't seem so laughable anymore. Weeks passed after Uncle Fred's funeral, and life returned to its quiet rhythm, but the thought of that so-called family curse kept gnawing at me. It didn't help that I started noticing things around my house, little oddities that kept piling up. At first it was subtle. A family photo knocked off the shelf, a framed portrait of my father with the glass cracked. I told myself it was just wear and tear, things shifting as time passed, but it didn't explain the fact that these little accidents always involved something related to one of the deceased. Then, one afternoon, I was sorting through old papers in the attic when I found my mother's will, tucked in a folder I had never seen before. There, in the fine print, was a name I hadn't expected, Richard. He was set to inherit a sizable amount, more than I'd ever imagined. I didn't remember her mentioning this, didn't recall Richard being close to her, or to anyone really. Something about it struck me as wrong, but I shoved the thought aside, telling myself it was normal, just family business. Still, Richard had been at every funeral, and now he was showing up in these legal documents. It felt like too much of a coincidence. And then the phone calls started. They were always late at night, always silent, but I could hear breathing on the other end. I tried to tell myself it was a wrong number, some prank, but it kept happening, night after night. And each time, I found myself thinking of Richard. I didn't know why, but his face popped into my head with each ring. The last straw came when I got a call from him out of the blue, his voice as smooth as ever, asking if I needed help with anything. He mentioned the family estate, talked about how we should work together to settle everything now that Uncle Fred was gone. It was a friendly enough conversation, but something about it chilled me to the core. I couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was up to something, so I started digging. I went through old family documents, wills, and letters, trying to piece together a pattern, and what I found made my stomach turn. Each family member who had died, my father, my mother, and now Uncle Fred, had altered their will in the months leading up to their deaths. And every time Richard's name appeared, he wasn't the main beneficiary, not enough to raise immediate suspicion, but he was there, collecting small amounts, piece by piece. The realization hit me slowly, creeping in as I went through the papers. Richard had been positioning himself quietly, methodically, to gain from each death. I felt sick to my stomach as I stared at the documents laid out in front of me. But that wasn't the worst of it. When I looked closer at the medical reports, the accident details, things didn't add up. My father's heart attack hadn't been as sudden as they made it seem. There were unexplained drugs in his system. My mother's drowning? There were bruises on her arms, but they had been dismissed as post-mortem injuries from the rocks. Uncle Fred's fall? The staircase had been tampered with, subtle enough to be missed at first glance, but the evidence was there. It was becoming clear that these weren't accidents, and Richard wasn't just lucky, he was making sure he benefited from every single death. I couldn't believe what I had uncovered. Richard, the distant cousin, the quiet one no one ever paid much attention to, had been orchestrating this for years. He had played into the family's superstitions, using the idea of a curse to mask his crimes, making each death look like fate. I wasn't sure what to do with the information. Going to the police seemed like the logical step, but I had no solid proof, nothing that would hold up in court. I needed more, so I confronted him. I invited him over under the pretense of needing help with settling some estate matters, trying to keep things casual. He came, as polite and calm as ever, but there was something in his eyes that unnerved me. As we talked, I asked him about the family curse, about the deaths. He laughed it off, said it was just bad luck, just a string of tragedies that happened to our unlucky family. But there was something in his tone, something smug, that made me realize he knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just benefiting from the deaths, he was enjoying it. I wanted to scream, to throw the evidence in his face, but I held back. I needed to be smart, to find a way to stop him without tipping him off. I went to the authorities, finally, armed with everything I had. The documents, the suspicious medical reports, the altered wills, it was enough to open an investigation. But Richard was clever, too clever. By the time the investigation started, he had vanished. No one knew where he went, and the police couldn't track him down. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a trail of bodies and unanswered questions. For months, I lived in fear, waiting for the knock on the door, the shadow lurking in the corner, knowing that he wasn't done with me yet. And then the letters started arriving. No return address, no name, just cryptic messages. Soon, you're next, see you soon. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, that I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew it was him. He was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to finish what he had started. And I was trapped, knowing that no matter where I went, he could find me. The authorities couldn't help, and I was left to live with the knowledge that the real curse wasn't some supernatural force. It was Richard, and he wasn't going to stop. It started out like any other weekend, just a few friends hanging out, trying to come up with something new and exciting to do. Ryan, Jake, Lila, Sarah, and I had been urban explorers for a while now, scouring our town for forgotten places. And that weekend, Jake had a bold idea. He suggested we check out Crestview Asylum, a notorious old hospital on the edge of town that had been abandoned for decades. It was raining that night, a steady downpour that made the idea of going even more tempting somehow. We'd heard the stories about the asylum, whispers of patient mistreatment, strange disappearances, and of course, the rumor that the building was haunted. The most famous of those stories was about Dr. Samuel Lark, the hospital's head physician, who disappeared under mysterious circumstances the night the hospital was abruptly closed. They said he still wandered the halls, a ghost looking for his lost patients. Of course, we didn't believe any of that nonsense, but Jake had always been one for pushing the limits. He grinned at us as we piled into his beat-up car, driving out toward the asylum through the rain-slicked streets. The building loomed ahead, its silhouette sharp against the night sky, windows shattered, and ivy creeping up the walls like it was trying to pull the structure back into the earth. We parked the car a little distance away, cutting the engine and sitting there for a moment, just staring at the place. It was darker than it should have been inside, like the rain had swallowed all the light and a cold wind whipped through the trees around us. Jake was the first to speak, breaking the silence with a laugh. "Come on, guys. We're just going to take a quick look around, get some pictures, and call it a night." Reluctantly, we all climbed out of the car and followed him to the entrance, an old, rusted door hanging off its hinges. The place looked like it hadn't seen a person in years, but the door creaked open like it was welcoming us in. Inside, it was worse than we thought. Water dripped from the ceiling in steady beats, echoing in the vast emptiness of the hallways. Graffiti covered the walls, and old, rusted hospital equipment was scattered about, forgotten and broken. Still, we pressed on, joking to keep our spirits up, our footsteps crunching against broken tiles on the floor. But something didn't feel right. There was an odd sensation in the air, like we weren't as alone as we thought. We laughed it off, but part of me couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, we weren't the first ones to be here tonight. We wandered deeper into the asylum, following long hallways that twisted and turned in ways that made it easy to lose track of where we were. Each room we passed seemed frozen in time, like the hospital had been abandoned in a rush, with beds still unmade and medical tools scattered on countertops. Lila snapped photos with her phone, excited by the decaying beauty of the place, but the rest of us were quieter than usual. Jake, always the bravest, led the way, pushing open doors and peeking into rooms, his flashlight casting long shadows across the moldy walls. The air was damp, and everything smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something I couldn't quite place. It was in the old surgery wing that things started to get weird. We were just about to leave when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hall behind us. Jake stopped, turning around with a cocky grin. "Probably just the wind," he joked, but none of us laughed. We listened for a minute longer, but the sound had stopped. Still, it put all of us on edge. We continued down the hall, and that's when Sarah noticed something. At the far end of the corridor, in the dim light, there was a door that looked slightly ajar, as if someone had recently gone through it. Jake, of course, couldn't resist. "Guess we've got company," he said, heading straight for it. The rest of us hesitated, but we weren't about to let him go alone. The room on the other side was small, a cramped office with dusty filing cabinets and papers strewn everywhere. Jake poked around, rifling through the drawers, while the rest of us hung back, glancing nervously at each other. That's when the door behind us slammed shut. No one touched it, no gust of wind had come through, but it had closed, hard enough to shake the walls. We ran to it, but it wouldn't budge. Jake laughed again, but there was an edge to it this time. "All right, who's messing with us?" he called out, but no answer came. I could feel the tension rising in the room as we all realized the door wasn't locked, just stuck, like someone or something on the other side was keeping us in. Ryan, always practical, forced it open after a few minutes of struggle, but by then, no one was laughing anymore. We moved quickly after that, the fun of the night starting to wear thin as the strange occurrences piled up. And as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being led somewhere, guided deeper into the asylum by an invisible hand. By the time we reached the lower floors of the hospital, the mood had shifted entirely. No one was joking anymore. The basement, where the more experimental treatments had supposedly taken place, was colder than the rest of the building. The walls down here were different too, damp and covered in some kind of black mold that made the air thick and unpleasant. Sarah had been the first to suggest turning back, but Jake wouldn't hear it. "Come on, this is where all the best stuff is. Look at this place." He was right. The basement was full of old, rusted medical equipment, gurneys still covered with faded, stained sheets, and cabinets with cracked glass doors. But it was also the most unnerving part of the hospital. There were no windows down here, and the only light came from our flashlights, which barely seemed to cut through the darkness. It was down one of these long, narrow halls that we saw him for the first time. At first it was just a shadow, something at the very edge of our vision that disappeared as soon as we turned our lights toward it. But then, as we rounded a corner, there he was. Standing at the far end of the hallway, facing us, was a man in what looked like an old, dirty doctor's coat. He didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching us. Lila gasped, and for a long moment, none of us spoke. Then Jake, always the bold one, called out, "Hey, you lost or something?" The figure didn't respond. He just turned and walked through a doorway, disappearing into the darkness beyond. Jake, against all of our protests, rushed after him. "Wait!" Ryan shouted, but Jake was already gone, vanishing into the same room. We ran after him, but when we got there, the room was empty. There was no sign of the man in the coat or Jake, just an old examination room with rusted equipment and broken tiles. Sarah started to panic, calling out for Jake, but no answer came. We searched the room, the hall, even the adjacent corridors, but there was no trace of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Hours seemed to pass as we scoured the basement, calling for Jake and searching every room we came across. But the deeper we went, the more it felt like the hospital was shifting around us, the halls twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. And always, at the very edge of our lights, we'd catch glimpses of him, the man in the coat, always watching, always just out of reach. It wasn't until we stumbled into an old storage room that we found our first real clue. There, hidden beneath a pile of broken furniture, was a stack of old hospital files. The top one labeled Lark Samuel. The file was thick, filled with notes about Dr. Lark's time at the hospital, his questionable experiments, and most chillingly, his disappearance the night the hospital was shut down. But according to the records, Lark hadn't vanished into the night like everyone thought. He'd stayed behind, hidden in the bowels of the hospital, using the tunnels and hidden rooms beneath the building to continue his twisted work. Sarah pieced it together first. "He's still here," she whispered, her voice shaking, "and he's been watching us this whole time." The realization hit us hard. This wasn't a ghost or a haunting. We were being hunted by a real, living man. A man who had spent years perfecting the art of terrorizing anyone who dared to come near his hospital. Suddenly, the footsteps, the slamming doors, the shifting shadows, it all made sense. It was him, and we had walked right into his trap. We turned to leave, but as we stepped out into the hall, we heard it. A low, mechanical sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It was coming from the direction of the stairs, the only way out. With no other option, we ran toward the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The sound of something dragging grew louder behind us, but we didn't stop to look back. We reached the stairwell just as the lights overhead flickered and went out completely. Ryan shoved the door open, and we practically fell through, scrambling up the steps toward the first floor. But as we neared the exit, a figure stepped into the doorway. It was him, Dr. Lark, standing there, blocking our only way out. For a moment, none of us moved, unsure of what to do. But then, without warning, Lila darted forward, shoving past him with a scream. The rest of us followed, not waiting to see what he would do. We burst through the front doors and into the rain-soaked night, sprinting across the You know how every small town has its share of stories. Ghosts, haunted houses, or that creepy old place no one dares to visit. For us, it was the Midnight Man. It was one of those tales you'd hear around a bonfire or at a sleepover, passed down from the older kids to the younger ones. According to the legend, back in the 80s, there was this guy who lived on the edge of town. He was said to be some kind of drifter, a shadow of a person who nobody really knew well. People claimed that every so often, someone would go missing, and the whispers always pointed back to him. They called him the Midnight Man because the disappearances supposedly happened at midnight, like clockwork. The story had faded into the background over the years, just a spooky tale to scare new kids at school. That was until recently. It all started when Jenny, one of the local high schoolers, went missing. Everyone assumed she'd run away. I remember the day like it was yesterday. It had been raining for hours, the kind of steady downpour that turns the streets into rivers and makes the world feel smaller. The town was buzzing with gossip, as small towns do, and I kept hearing her name whispered everywhere I went. But it wasn't until the next day that things got strange. I was heading to work, and just as I stepped outside, I saw something unusual. A note taped to my front door. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a single line written in shaky handwriting. Midnight comes for us all. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank. Kids playing around, trying to get a rise out of people by reviving the old legend. But as the rain continued to fall and the hours passed, the weight of it settled in. That's when the stories started coming back to me, the tales of the Midnight Man. And I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it than just an old urban myth. Jenny was gone, and the rumors around town were only getting louder. At first, people thought it was just a fluke, but then it happened again. A week later, someone else went missing. This time, it was Greg, the guy who worked at the gas station. He was a quiet dude, always kept to himself, so when he didn't show up for his shift, no one thought much of it. But when his car was found parked just outside town, engine off and keys still in the ignition, the whispers started again. People were talking about the Midnight Man like it was the 80s all over again. I couldn't help but notice how the disappearances seemed to fit the old legend. Always at night, always someone alone, and always without a trace. Then came the footsteps. I'd hear them late at night just outside my house. At first, I tried to ignore it, but it became impossible to deny. Every night around midnight, there'd be this faint sound, like someone walking just outside. I'd check, but there was never anyone there. I wasn't the only one either. My neighbor, Mr. Harold, swore he'd seen someone lurking near his yard a few nights ago. It was starting to feel like the whole town was being watched, like something or someone was waiting for the right moment. The thought crossed my mind. What if it was all connected? What if someone was trying to bring the legend of the Midnight Man to life? But who would do something like that? The rain had picked up again by the time I decided to visit Greg's old place. It wasn't far from mine, and I needed answers. Or at least, I needed to see for myself if there were any clues about what had happened. When I got there, the house was dark, empty, just like you'd expect. But something felt off, and not in a supernatural way. More like someone had been there recently. That's when I found it, lying on the ground near his front door. Another note, just like the one I'd found at my place. Midnight comes for us all. I should have taken the notes to the police right away, but part of me didn't want to believe it was real. Maybe I was overthinking things. After all, urban legends don't just come to life, right? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, only this time, they didn't stop. I could hear them getting closer, like whoever it was wasn't trying to hide anymore. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound. And that's when I saw him. A man, standing at the edge of the yard, barely visible in the rain. He was tall, wearing a hooded jacket, the kind you'd barely notice unless you were looking for it. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching. I wanted to call the police, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the thought that no one would believe me. The man turned slowly and walked away, disappearing into the rain-soaked street. It was only then that I realized I hadn't been imagining things. Someone was out there, playing with our fears, using the legend to scare us. But why? I had to find out. The next day, I decided to visit the town library. If the killer was copying the legend, maybe there was something in the town's history that could give me a clue. The old newspaper archives were buried in the back, collecting dust. And that's where I found it. An article from the 1980s detailing the original disappearances. There was something familiar about the description of the suspect, a drifter passing through town who was never caught, and in the corner of the page, a photograph. The man in the hooded jacket. The photograph from the article sent a chill down my spine. I recognized the face. It was an older man, the kind you'd see and forget about, just another shadow passing through town. But I'd seen him before. He'd been at the local diner a few days ago, sitting alone in the back. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Now it all clicked. The person behind the recent disappearances wasn't the Midnight Man from the legend. It was a copycat, someone who knew the old story and was using it to cover their tracks. Someone who had probably grown up hearing the legend, just like the rest of us. The man from the diner had left town that same night, but the disappearances didn't stop. That's when it hit me. It wasn't just one person. There were more. The killer was part of something bigger, a group perhaps, all feeding off the fear that the legend created, and they were using it to terrorize the town without anyone suspecting the truth. I knew I had to act fast. I took the old newspaper article to the police, explained everything I'd pieced together. At first, they were skeptical, but when they started looking into it, they found more clues. There had been other towns, other legends, all with similar disappearances. This wasn't just an isolated case. The killers were traveling from place to place, leaving a trail of bodies and fear behind them. It's been months since the police uncovered the truth. The media went wild with the story, labeling it as the work of a twisted cult. They arrested a few suspects, but many of them disappeared before they could be caught. The town has tried to move on, but the scars are still there. People don't talk about the Midnight Man anymore, but the fear lingers. Every so often, someone swears they see a hooded figure in the distance, watching from the shadows. Even though I know the legend wasn't real, I can't shake the feeling that there's something unfinished. That night, when I saw the man standing outside my house, I thought it was over. But now, I wonder if it ever will be. The killers may be gone, but the fear they planted is still alive. And every time the rain falls, I can't help but listen for those footsteps. They say legends never die. I guess they're right. Because somewhere out there, someone's still keeping the story alive. And the next town might not be so lucky. I'd been in my new apartment for a few weeks, and things were finally starting to feel normal. I'd moved in after a rough breakup, hoping to clear my head and get some space. The place was a bit older than I'd like, but it had this kind of charm that made me feel at home. It also came with some of the previous tenants' furniture, which was a plus since I didn't have much of my own. One of the things that stood out to me from the very beginning was this antique mirror in the hallway. It was big, old, and had an ornate frame that looked like it was something out of a Gothic novel. The glass itself was slightly warped, and it had these little imperfections that made the reflections seem strange. I remember telling myself it was probably just an old mirror, nothing more. But one night, as I was heading to bed, I thought I saw something strange in it. A shape behind me, just barely visible in the reflection. I stopped for a moment, staring at the glass, but everything looked normal. Maybe I was just tired. After all, unpacking and setting everything up had been exhausting. I laughed it off, told myself it was nothing, and went to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror had something off about it. The next few days were uneventful, at least at first. I'd go about my routine, work during the day, and come home in the evening to unwind. But every time I walked past that mirror, something felt strange. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on right away. It was just a sense, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. Then the reflections started getting weirder. I'd pass by the mirror, glance at it like anyone would, and sometimes I'd notice that the reflection didn't match up with my movements. At first, it was subtle, like I'd move my hand and the reflection would lag just a bit behind. Other times it looked like there was a flicker, a shadow that shouldn't be there. It wasn't enough to freak me out. Not yet. I chalked it up to the glass being old and distorted, but the more I noticed it, the harder it became to ignore. One evening, I caught what looked like someone else's face in the reflection, just for a split second. I turned around, but no one was there. Just the empty hallway. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, but a part of me knew that wasn't the case. By now, the mirror was starting to get under my skin. I couldn't walk past it without looking, without expecting to see something out of place. I even mentioned it to my friend Claire one afternoon when she came over. She laughed it off, saying I'd been watching too many horror movies. But even she admitted the mirror was a little creepy. That night, everything changed. I was brushing my teeth, getting ready for bed, when I caught something in the corner of my eye. A face, a man's face, just barely visible behind mine in the reflection. I froze, staring at it, waiting for it to disappear. But it didn't. It stayed there, watching me, as if it belonged in the mirror. I whipped around, expecting to find someone standing behind me, but the bathroom was empty. I stood there, trying to figure out what had just happened, my mind racing to find an explanation. There was no one in the apartment but me. I knew that. Yet the face in the mirror had been so clear, so real. I grabbed my phone and texted Claire, telling her what I'd seen. But by the time she responded, I'd already decided I wasn't imagining things. I went to bed that night, but sleep didn't come easily. The thought of that face stayed with me, hovering in the back of my mind. A few days passed, and I started avoiding the mirror altogether. I'd catch myself glancing at it, half expecting to see the face again. But I wouldn't let myself look too closely. It was driving me crazy. I needed to figure out what was going on. I decided to take a closer look at the mirror, thinking maybe I'd find some logical explanation. Maybe it was just a trick of the glass or the lighting, something simple that would explain everything. I took the mirror off the wall, figuring I'd clean the back, maybe dust it off. But when I pulled it away from the wall, I found something I wasn't expecting. Behind the mirror, there was a small, hidden compartment with a two-way glass setup. I stared at it, my mind struggling to process what I was looking at. This wasn't a haunted mirror. Someone had been watching me. All those strange reflections, the face I'd seen, it hadn't been a ghost or a figment of my imagination. It had been real. Someone had been behind that mirror, spying on me. I called the police immediately, shaking as I explained what I'd found. They came, inspected the apartment, and confirmed what I feared. There was a small crawl space behind the wall, large enough for someone to hide in. The maintenance guy who used to live in the building had been using it to spy on the tenants, including me. He'd been arrested before for something similar, but no one knew he'd set this up in my apartment. The police assured me he was in custody, but that didn't stop the uneasy feeling from settling in. I moved out a week later, unable to stay in a place where I'd been watched like that. Even now, months later, I can't look at a mirror without thinking about what happened. I still wonder how long he'd been there, watching me without me knowing. And sometimes when I walk by a mirror, I think I catch a glimpse of something behind me, something that shouldn't be there. But I don't turn around anymore. I don't want to know if I'm right. I'd always been a skeptic, the kind of person who shrugged off ghost stories and conspiracy theories, but something about living alone for the first time began to mess with my head in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't even a big deal, moving into that apartment. Just a small place on the edge of town, nothing special. It was quiet most days, and that's what I liked about it. The kind of quiet you don't notice until you're alone for too long, though. At first, everything seemed normal. I'd come home from work, drop my bag by the door, and slump onto the couch, feeling the weight of the day. But then, things started feeling off. Not in a supernatural way, more like a gnawing sense that something wasn't right. One evening, I was scrolling through my phone, killing time before bed, when I caught a glimpse of something strange in the corner of the room. It wasn't a clear figure, more like a vague outline that seemed to blend into the shadows by the window. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. You know, after staring at a screen for hours, you see things that aren't really there. I blinked a few times, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, the shape was gone. I chalked it up to tiredness, told myself it was nothing, and moved on. But over the next few nights, I noticed it again. Always in the same spot, lurking near the window. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a shadow blending into the dark room. But it didn't go away. It stayed there, hovering, almost as if it was waiting for me to notice it. By the end of the week, I was more curious than scared. I remember standing in front of the window, staring at the empty space where the shadow had been. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just the quiet of the night outside and the dim light from the street lamp filtering through the curtains. But something was off. I just couldn't put my finger on what it was. That shadow was more than just a trick of the light. I was sure of it. I told myself to stop thinking about it, but it wasn't easy. When you live alone, your mind starts to fill the silence with things that aren't there. That's what I figured was happening, that I was just overthinking it. Until the night it moved. The night it moved was when things started to get weird. I had been in bed, half asleep, when I saw it again. This time, not by the window, but closer. It was subtle at first, almost like the room darkened in one corner. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was had shifted. I got up, turned on the light, and looked around. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. I stood there for a while, just staring into that dark corner, feeling a creeping sense of unease. It wasn't fear, not yet, but more like I was waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next morning, I almost laughed it off. I had a lot on my mind back then. Work stress, the move, adjusting to being alone. I figured it was just the natural anxiety that came with all of that. But the following nights, it kept happening. That same shadow in different parts of the room, always in the corner of my vision. Never clear, never fully visible, but always there. I started making excuses for it. Maybe the street lamp outside was casting weird shadows. Maybe it was just the way my furniture was arranged. I even thought about getting blackout curtains to block the light. But deep down, part of me knew that wasn't it. It wasn't just the shadows anymore. I began hearing things too. Small, almost imperceptible sounds that felt out of place. Like faint rustling or the creak of something shifting when it shouldn't. I'd check the windows, make sure they were locked. I checked the doors too, even though I knew I'd locked them before bed. Everything was as it should be, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But again, I brushed it off. It's amazing what your mind can convince you of when you don't want to deal with the possibility of something sinister. I wasn't ready to admit that maybe, just maybe, there was someone else involved. By the time the third week rolled around, I had almost gotten used to the strange shadows. They became part of my nightly routine, something I would notice, acknowledge, and then try to forget. But it got harder when the disturbances became more physical. I started waking up in the middle of the night to noises I couldn't explain. I'd sit up in bed, listening carefully to the creaks and rustles, feeling like I was just a second too late to catch whatever or whoever it was. There were moments I thought I saw the shadow closer, near the door, or right by the closet. I'd sit there, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, trying to tell myself it was nothing. But one night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a creak or a rustle. It was the unmistakable sound of a window sliding open. I shot out of bed and ran to the living room, fully expecting to see something or someone there. But there was nothing. The window was closed. I checked it, tugged on it, and found it locked tight. I stood there in the silence, trying to convince myself that I hadn't heard what I thought I did. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed. I told myself it was just a precaution, that it wasn't necessary. But the truth was, I was starting to feel like something more was going on. The shadows, the noises, the open window that wasn't open, it all felt too deliberate, too targeted. Someone was messing with me. And it was working. The breaking point came the night I found the note. It was a Tuesday evening and I had just gotten home from work. As usual, the apartment was dark and quiet. I went to the kitchen to grab something to eat, and that's when I saw it. A small piece of paper, folded neatly, sitting in the middle of the kitchen counter. I stared at it for a moment, trying to remember if I'd left it there. I hadn't. I picked it up, unfolded it, and read the words written inside. Nice new curtains. I froze. The curtains were new. I'd only put them up 2 days ago. The realization hit me slowly, like a creeping wave of nausea. Someone had been in my apartment, and they had been watching me. I went through the apartment in a panic, checking every room, every corner, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, nothing. I called the police. They came, checked the place out, and told me the same thing. No signs of a break-in. They filed a report, but that was it. I was left standing there, holding the note, wondering just how long this had been going on. How long had someone been in my home, watching me, manipulating the shadows, making me feel like I was losing my grip on reality? The shadow people weren't figments of my imagination. They were real, and they were watching. The note changed everything. I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. I packed up my things and moved out within the week. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been watching me was still out there, waiting for their next move. Even in my new place, far from that apartment, I found myself checking the locks obsessively, peering into dark corners expecting to see something, or someone, lurking there. The police never found out who it was. The investigation didn't go anywhere. It was like whoever had been stalking me had vanished as suddenly as they had appeared. But I knew better. I knew they were still out there, somewhere, watching. I tried to move on with my life, tried to put the experience behind me. But every now and then, when I'm home alone at night, I can't help but glance towards the windows. And sometimes, just for a moment, I think I see something. A shadow, barely visible, lingering just out of sight. But when I turn to look, it's always gone. Or maybe it was never really gone in the first place. I still don't know for sure. But I'll never forget the way those shadows made me feel. Not supernatural, but deeply real. And deeply terrifying. It was raining the night I first heard it. I'd been living in my new place for about a month, trying to settle into a life that felt anything but settled. The house was old, creaky, the kind of place that seemed to breathe with the weather. But I liked that it had character, and I'd convinced myself that the strange sounds were just part of the charm. That is, until the night the chanting began. It was subtle at first, almost like an echo that didn't belong in my world. I was in my basement, unpacking the last of the boxes I'd been ignoring for weeks, when the sound drifted in through the thin walls. A low, rhythmic hum, like voices, but too distant to make out any words. I stood still, listening, thinking it might be the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But the sound was persistent, almost deliberate, as if someone, or something, was making sure I heard it. The rain outside had picked up, tapping insistently against the windows as the chanting grew louder. I walked over to the wall, pressing my ear against the cool surface, trying to catch more of the noise. The sound seemed to come from the basement of the house next door. The neighbor's place was run down, the kind of place you'd expect to see boarded up, not lived in. But someone did live there, though I'd only ever seen him in passing. A man in his 50s, quiet, unremarkable. Until now. That chanting, though, it didn't belong in a normal neighborhood, especially not late at night. Especially not like this. I didn't sleep well that night. The rain, the chanting, they blended together, forming a constant hum that wouldn't leave me alone. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right next door. It wasn't just the chanting. There were other things. Strange things, like how the neighbors' windows were always covered, even during the day, or the way I'd see people, never the same ones, coming and going at odd hours, never staying long. I hadn't thought much of it before, but now, with the chanting echoing in my mind, it all felt connected. I decided to do something I hadn't done since I moved in. I went outside, in the rain, and walked over to the edge of the property line, looking at the house next door. It looked empty from the outside, like it had been abandoned for years, but I knew better. There were lights on behind those thick curtains, and cars parked out front at strange times of the day. I thought about knocking on the door just to introduce myself, to ask if everything was okay, but something about that place held me back. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it wasn't just the chanting. There was something else, something darker. As I stood there, the rain soaking through my jacket, I saw movement from one of the basement windows. Just a shadow, but it was enough to make me take a step back. Who was down there? And what the hell were they doing? That night, the chanting returned, louder this time, almost like a low, throbbing pulse that seeped through the walls. I didn't sleep again. I couldn't. A few nights later, I heard something different. The chanting had started again, but this time it was accompanied by something else. A heavy thud, followed by what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. And then a crash. I was on my feet before I even realized it, grabbing my flashlight and heading out the door into the rain. I don't know what I thought I'd find, but the sounds were louder than ever. Urgent, frantic, almost desperate. I made my way around the side of the house next door, slipping through the bushes until I found myself crouched beneath one of the basement windows. The curtains were drawn tight, but there was a small gap, just enough for me to peer through. Inside, the basement was dimly lit by a few candles, their flickering light casting long, distorted shadows across the room. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. There were people down there, huddled around a table, their heads bowed, hands moving in strange, synchronized gestures. And then I saw the bags. Piles of them stacked high against the wall, small, plastic, filled with what looked like powder or pills. I didn't need to get closer to know what it was. Drugs. A lot of them. This wasn't a ritual. This was a drug operation. And those weren't occult symbols on the table, they were scales. And the chanting? Just voices. Muffled, distorted by the walls. But the sounds were wrong, too rhythmic, too coordinated. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was witnessing something darker than a drug deal. I crouched lower, trying to stay hidden, but the rain was relentless, dripping down the back of my neck as I watched. I don't know how long I stood there, crouched in the rain, staring through that tiny gap in the curtain. But suddenly, the basement door swung open, and I ducked behind the bushes just in time. Two men emerged, carrying duffel bags, their faces shadowed under their hoods. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound, as they moved toward a van parked in the alley behind the house. I watched as they loaded the bags into the back, glancing around nervously, like they knew someone might be watching. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. The basement lights went out, and the house fell silent. I crept back to my own house, my mind racing. I needed to call someone, but I wasn't sure who. The police? Would they even believe me? I didn't have much proof, just shadows and whispers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen was just the surface of something much bigger, much worse. The chanting had stopped, but the memory of it lingered, like a warning. I called the police the next morning. I told them about the strange noises, the shadows, and the bags I'd seen in the basement. They didn't seem surprised. In fact, they told me they'd been watching that house for months. It turned out my neighbor wasn't just some eccentric guy with a fascination for the occult. He was running one of the largest drug operations in the area, using the rumors of strange rituals to keep people away. The chanting, the shadows, the odd visitors, it was all part of the cover, a way to scare off anyone who got too curious. The police raided the house a few days later, arresting everyone inside, but they warned me to stay vigilant. There were still others out there, others who hadn't been caught. I moved not long after that. I couldn't stay in that house, not after everything that had happened. But even now, sometimes when it rains, I swear I can still hear it, that low, rhythmic hum. I tell myself it's just the wind, just the rain. But part of me knows better. Some things never really leave you, no matter how hard you try to forget. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when the package arrived. I had almost forgotten about the possibility of an inheritance from Aunt Margaret. She passed away a few months ago, leaving behind a house filled with antique curiosities that no one in the family really wanted. I was surprised to find a large box on my doorstep, soaked from the relentless rain outside. I dragged it inside, wondering what piece of her collection had been sent my way. Inside, I found an antique doll, wrapped carefully in layers of cloth and old paper. It looked fragile, its porcelain face cracked slightly, giving it a kind of permanent sneer. The doll wore a faded, lace-trimmed dress that might have been white once, though it had yellowed with time. Its glassy blue eyes stared blankly ahead, unblinking, as though it had been waiting for me. I wasn't much for dolls, let alone ones that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. But I figured it was just an odd relic from Aunt Margaret's collection. I placed it on a shelf in my living room, thinking it could be a quirky addition to my otherwise modern decor. That night, as the rain continued to patter against the windows, I started to feel an odd discomfort. I'd catch myself glancing at the doll as if it had shifted positions slightly. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself. After all, it had been a stressful few months since Nick and I broke up. Thinking about him always made me feel a little sick. Nick had a way of getting under my skin, making me question myself, my reality, even my sanity. We'd been together for years, but in the end, I couldn't handle the way he played with my mind. I brushed off the creeping sense that something was off and went to bed, trying to ignore the fact that I felt a little unsettled in my own home. The next morning, the doll was still sitting on the shelf, just as I'd left it. Or at least I thought so. For a split second, I had the strangest notion that its head had turned slightly, but I quickly dismissed it. I had bigger things to worry about: work, bills, the general chaos of daily life. Still, a nagging feeling began to settle in the back of my mind. I found myself checking on the doll more often than I wanted to admit. Each time it was sitting there, exactly as it had been. But that didn't stop me from feeling like something wasn't quite right. As the days went on, small things started happening around the apartment. Things I couldn't immediately explain, though I tried my best to rationalize them. I'd leave a book on the coffee table, only to find it on the floor the next morning. My keys, usually hung up by the door, would sometimes appear on the kitchen counter instead. At first, I figured I was just being forgetful, distracted by the endless work emails and errands that piled up. But then the doll started moving. I didn't see it move, of course, but I knew it wasn't where I'd left it. One night, I came home and found it sitting in the middle of the kitchen table, staring right at me. I had never put it there. In fact, I hadn't even touched it since the day it arrived. I chalked it up to being overworked, stressed. I moved the doll back to the shelf, its rightful place, and tried to forget about it. But that didn't last long. A few days later, I came downstairs to find the doll sitting in the armchair by the window, as though it had been watching the rain pour down outside. I was starting to feel uncomfortable, but I wasn't ready to admit it. Part of me thought maybe it was a joke. Maybe one of my friends was messing with me. But who would have done that? No one had a key to my place. And then the whispers started. Late at night, when the apartment was quiet, I'd hear faint sounds. It almost sounded like someone muttering under their breath, too quiet to make out, but loud enough to set my nerves on edge. I tried to tell myself it was the pipes or the wind or something equally mundane, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll had something to do with it. It had become a constant presence, one I couldn't ignore. I even started dreaming about it. In one dream, I saw it standing in the corner of my bedroom, watching me. Its glass eyes glinted in the dark, and though it never moved, I knew it was waiting for something. I woke up in a cold sweat. The image of the doll burned into my mind. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just a stupid piece of porcelain. But still, I couldn't bring myself to move it out of the living room. One night, after a long, exhausting day at work, I came home to find the doll lying on the floor, face down. It was an odd position for it to be in, like it had been carelessly dropped. I was alone. No one had been in my apartment. I picked it up, staring into those lifeless eyes, feeling a deep sense of unease that I couldn't shake. This time I didn't just place it back on the shelf. I stuffed it into the back of a cabinet, behind some old books and photo albums, thinking that would put an end to the nonsense. But the next morning, it was back on the shelf. I froze, staring at it, my mind racing for any reasonable explanation. How could it have moved on its own? I had locked the door, checked the windows. No one could have come inside. The whispers were louder that night, more insistent, like they were calling my name. I knew I had to be imagining it, but that didn't make it any less real in the moment. I started receiving strange text messages from an unknown number. They were vague, cryptic, but unsettling all the same. "Do you like your new friend?" one read. Another simply said, "I'm watching you." I wanted to ignore them, but a part of me couldn't help but connect the messages to the doll. The doll that seemed to be everywhere I turned, no matter how hard I tried to get rid of it. I couldn't escape the feeling that someone or something was messing with me. I was spiraling, unable to focus on anything but the doll. It had taken over my thoughts, my nightmares, and even my waking hours. But then something clicked. I remembered how Nick used to send me texts like that, back when we were together. Back when he thought it was funny to gaslight me, make me question my own reality. I hadn't heard from him in months, not since I blocked him after the breakup. But the messages, the doll, the creeping paranoia, it all started to feel like him. His twisted sense of humor, his need for control. I tore through the apartment, searching for any sign that he had been inside. And that's when I found it. A small, barely noticeable hole drilled into the doll's eye. I pulled it closer, my fingers trembling as I pried at the porcelain. Inside was a tiny camera, hidden deep within the doll's head. My stomach dropped as I realized what this meant. Nick had been watching me, all this time. The texts, the whispers, the movements. It wasn't my imagination. It was him. He must have planted the doll here, sneaking into my apartment when I was at home. Suddenly, everything made sense. I called the police that same night, my voice shaking as I explained what I had found. They took the doll as evidence, started investigating Nick immediately. It turned out he had kept a spare key to my apartment after we broke up, using it to come and go as he pleased. He'd been watching me through the camera, moving the doll around, playing his sick games to mess with my mind. They arrested him, but the damage was already done. Even with him behind bars, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Every shadow felt too close. Every unfamiliar sound too loud. I tried to move on, to put it all behind me, but part of me still feels like Nick is out there, waiting. Some nights, when the rain pounds against the windows and the apartment feels too quiet, I find myself looking at the shelf where the doll used to sit. It's empty now, but the memories linger. I wish I could say it's over, that I'm safe, but the truth is, I'm not sure I'll ever feel that way again. It was one of those endless rainy days where the world outside looks smeared and dull, almost like it's been forgotten. The kind of day where time itself feels slower, stretched out, and lazy. Emily and I sat in the waiting room of the adoption agency. The soft patter of rain on the windows, the only sound for what felt like hours. We were anxious, of course, but also excited. This was the day we'd been waiting for, the moment when we'd finally meet the child who might become part of our family. We had been through months of interviews, paperwork, home visits, all leading to this. The social worker, a woman with a tired smile and slightly disheveled hair, finally came into the room and motioned for us to follow her. As we walked down a narrow hallway, I noticed how the rain seemed louder, almost echoing through the small building. We were led into a small room, bare except for a few chairs and a single window overlooking the parking lot. And there he was, Oliver. He sat quietly, his legs swinging slightly as they dangled from the chair, his hands resting in his lap. He was 8 years old, but there was something in the way he carried himself that seemed older, more reserved. "Oliver, this is Emily and Jake," the social worker said softly. The boy looked up at us with dark, wide eyes, but he didn't smile. He didn't even blink. He just stared at us for a moment, like he was sizing us up. I cleared my throat, trying to break the strange silence that had settled over the room. "Hi, Oliver," I said, attempting a warm smile, but he didn't respond right away. He just kept staring, his eyes shifting from me to Emily and back again. Finally, he spoke. "They'll come for me," he whispered. Emily shot me a glance, her brow furrowed. The social worker quickly interjected, explaining that Oliver had been through a lot, that he sometimes said things like that. She assured us it was nothing to worry about. But there was something about the way he said it, the calm certainty in his voice, that stuck with me. The rain outside grew heavier as we filled out the final paperwork, each signature feeling like a commitment we weren't quite prepared for. Oliver sat silently through it all, not a word, not a sound, just watching us. By the time we left the agency and drove home, the rain had turned into a full-on downpour. Emily sat in the passenger seat, stealing glances at Oliver in the back. He was staring out the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. At one point, I thought I heard him whisper something again, but I couldn't make it out. Emily heard it too. Neither of us said anything. The rain didn't let up for the next few days. It was like the storm had settled over our town, bringing with it a kind of gloom that felt impossible to shake. At first, everything seemed fine. Oliver spent most of his time in his room, quietly playing with toys or drawing. He wasn't like most kids. There were no tantrums, no loud outbursts. He was calm, too calm. Emily and I tried to engage him, tried to make him feel comfortable in his new home, but there was a distance to him, like he was there but not really there. And then the strange things started happening. It began with small, almost imperceptible things. The first was the vase. It was a simple, decorative vase we kept on the kitchen table, one that had never moved unless someone picked it up. One afternoon, while I was reading in the living room and Emily was in the kitchen, the vase slid across the table. Neither of us saw it happen, but we both heard the distinct sound of it scraping across the wood. Emily called me into the kitchen, and we just stared at it for a moment. "Did you?" she started to ask, but I shook my head. Oliver was nowhere to be seen, just playing quietly in his room. Another day passed, and then something else. The door to Oliver's room opened on its own. I had closed it that morning, I was sure of it. But there it was, wide open. I asked Emily if she had been in there, and she shook her head, looking just as confused as I was. And then there was Oliver's behavior. He wasn't scared or even curious about the strange occurrences. If anything, he seemed to expect them. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, he suddenly said, "The phone's going to ring." We looked at him, a little bewildered, and then, 5 seconds later, the phone rang. Emily jumped in her seat. I answered it, but there was no one on the other end, just static. I hung up, trying to brush it off as coincidence, but Emily was visibly shaken. After that, things seemed to escalate. The rain continued, drumming against the windows, turning the yard into a soggy mess. Every night, Oliver would sit by the window, staring out into the rain, whispering to himself. When I asked him what he was doing, he just looked at me and said, "They're coming." Emily started to lose sleep. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, hearing Oliver's voice, soft and low, like he was having a conversation with someone. But every time she checked, he was alone, just staring out the window. It was late one night, the rain heavier than ever, when things came to a head. The power went out. Emily was already on edge, her nerves stretched thin from the sleepless nights and the strange occurrences. I was out of town for work, leaving her alone with Oliver. She called me, her voice hushed, almost frantic. "He's doing something," she whispered. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach twisting as I tried to understand what she was saying. "Oliver," she said, "he's in his room, and he said he brought the darkness." I could hear the rain pounding against the roof of our house in the background, the distant rumble of thunder. I tried to reassure her, telling her it was just a coincidence, just a kid being weird, but even I wasn't convinced. She hung up the phone, promising to check on Oliver. The next morning, when I returned home, the house felt different. Emily was pale, her eyes haunted by something she couldn't quite put into words. She told me about the night before, how she had gone into Oliver's room after the power went out. He had been sitting there in the dark, completely still, his eyes wide open, staring at her. He said he did it, she told me, her voice shaking. He said he brought the darkness. I didn't know what to say. Oliver had been strange, sure, but this was something else. Emily didn't sleep that night, and neither did I. After that, Emily insisted we look into Oliver's past. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on, something we hadn't been told. So I went back to the adoption agency. I sat down with the social worker, the same tired woman who had introduced us to Oliver, and I asked her for more information. That's when I learned about Oliver's previous guardian, a woman who had been abusive, not in the physical sense, but in a way that was more insidious. She had convinced Oliver that he had powers, that he could control things, that he was special. It was part of her twisted manipulation, a way to keep him dependent on her, to make him believe that he couldn't survive without her guidance. The social worker explained that Oliver had been with her for years before being removed from her care. He had been conditioned to believe in his own abilities, and now, even after being placed in a new home, those beliefs still lingered. I sat there, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. All this time, Emily and I had been terrified, thinking something supernatural was happening, but it was all rooted in Oliver's trauma. He had been taught to believe in his powers, and in his mind, they were real. When I got home, I told Emily everything. She listened, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. We had been afraid of a child, afraid of a boy who had been manipulated and abused, who didn't know any better. But even knowing the truth didn't make it any easier. Oliver still whispered to himself at night. He still stared out the window, waiting for something we couldn't see. It's been a few weeks since we found out the truth. Oliver is in therapy now, seeing someone who specializes in trauma and psychological conditioning. Emily and I are trying to move on, trying to build a normal life, but the past lingers. The rain has finally stopped, but the house still feels cold, still feels like it's holding on to something we can't quite shake. Oliver is quieter now, more withdrawn than before. He doesn't talk about his powers as much, but every now and then he'll say something that sends a chill through the room. The other night, Emily woke up and found him sitting by the window again. He wasn't talking to himself this time, just staring out at the yard, where the last of the rain was soaking into the grass. When she asked him what he was doing, he turned to her and said, "He's coming back for me." We don't know who he is. We don't know if it's just a remnant of his trauma, a fragment of the lies he had been told, or if there's something more to it. We contacted the authorities, told them everything we knew about the previous guardian. They assured us that she wouldn't come near Oliver again, that she was being watched. But Emily and I can't shake the feeling that something's still wrong, that even though the rain has stopped, the storm hasn't passed. Oliver still sits by the window sometimes, waiting. And part of me wonders if, someday, what he's wait. I checked into the hotel late, well past sunset. It was one of those places you see off the highway, a bit worn down but still functional. A place that looks like it once had better days before time and cheap rates took over. Tom, the guy at the front desk, handed me my key without much conversation, his eyes glued to the TV behind him. He didn't seem all that interested in the customers, just another face doing a late shift. The lobby had that old hotel smell, a mix of stale air and faded carpet. I just wanted to get to my room and crash after a long day of driving and meetings. But as I walked towards the elevator, I noticed someone sitting in the far corner of the lobby. A tall man, slumped in a chair, hood pulled low over his face, hands in his lap. Something about him felt off. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, but it felt like he was watching me. even though his face was completely hidden. I shook off the weird feeling and stepped into the elevator, reminding myself it had been a long day. My room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of the hallway. As I walked towards the door, I thought I heard a soft creak, like someone shifting their weight behind me. But when I turned, the hallway was empty. I brushed it off as tiredness playing tricks on me. The room itself was basic. Bed, small desk, a chair by the window. Nothing special, but it was clean enough. I dropped my bag on the floor, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed without even bothering to turn on the TV. It was quiet, just the hum of the air conditioning unit and the faint patter of rain against the window. I closed my eyes, but that feeling from the lobby clung to me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. That stranger in the hoodie. There was something about him, something I couldn't quite place. I tried to push it out of my mind, telling myself it was just another traveler, some guy between stops like me, but still, I locked the door before turning off the lights. That night, I woke up a few times, not fully sure why. The room felt unusually still, almost as if I wasn't alone. But when I sat up, there was nothing there, just the same quiet room with the same rain tapping against the window. I thought about the stranger downstairs again. Then, in the early hours, as I drifted in and out of sleep, I heard it. A slow, deliberate sound, footsteps moving outside my door. I sat up staring at the darkened room. The footsteps stopped. I waited, but no knock came, no shadow passed under the door. It was as if someone had been there, and then just gone. The next morning, I chalked it all up to the weirdness of sleeping in a strange bed. I got dressed, went downstairs for breakfast, and passed the lobby on the way out. The man in the hoodie was there again, in the exact same chair, sitting in the same position, staring straight ahead. He didn't seem to move, not even when people passed by or the phone rang at the front desk. It struck me as odd, but I had a busy day ahead, so I didn't dwell on it. Meetings stretched on, and by the time I returned to the hotel that evening, it was raining harder. I walked into the lobby, and there he was. The man in the hoodie, still in the same chair. Still sitting in the same unnerving stillness, like he hadn't moved all day. I felt a twinge of unease creep back. This time, I couldn't ignore it. Something wasn't right about him, but no one else seemed to notice. Tom, the desk clerk, gave me the usual nod as I passed, but there was no mention of the man in the corner. I went back to my room, thinking maybe I was overreacting, but as I tried to settle in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not in the usual sense, but like there was an invisible eye somewhere on me, tracking my movements. The rain fell heavier, and the window rattled slightly against the wind. Around midnight, the footsteps started again. This time, they were closer, right outside my door. Slow, measured, like someone pacing just beyond the threshold. I didn't want to move, didn't want to get up and check the peephole, because a part of me was certain I didn't want to know what I'd see. The pacing continued, back and forth, then stopped. I listened, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than another guest, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I reached for the phone, but my hand hesitated over the receiver. Was I really going to call the front desk and report? What exactly? Footsteps. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound again, but this time it was different. It wasn't footsteps anymore. It was a slow, deliberate knock on my door. I didn't move at first. I sat there, staring at the door as if waiting for it to knock again, but it didn't. Just one knock, then silence. I forced myself to stand, my feet heavy, like they were glued to the floor. I crept towards the door, half expecting something to jump out at me the moment I got close. When I finally reached the peephole, I peered through cautiously, not really wanting to see what was on the other side. The hallway was dim, the flickering light casting strange shadows against the wall. And there he was, the man in the hoodie, standing right outside my door. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, and for a moment I thought maybe I was imagining things. But then I saw his hand, slowly reaching for the door handle. I backed away, my mind racing. What did he want? Why was he there? I stood frozen, staring at the door as if waiting for him to break it down. But after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again. Only this time, They were moving away. I listened as the sound faded down the hallway and the unsettling silence returned. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the door, waiting for the man to come back. But he never did, at least not that night. The next morning, I went straight to the front desk. Tom was there, same bored expression on his face, sipping his coffee like he hadn't a care in the world. I told him about the man in the hoodie, about how he was standing outside my room in the middle of the night. Tom's face didn't change, not even a flicker of concern. "He's a long-term guest," he said, shrugging. "Keeps to himself mostly. Bit strange, but harmless." Something about the way Tom said it rubbed me the wrong way, but I let it go. Still, that nagging feeling wouldn't leave me. I couldn't just brush it off. There was something about the man, something that didn't sit right. I went online, searching for anything I could find about the hotel, about the area, and that's when I found it. A news article about a missing guest from a few months back. A man staying at this very hotel had disappeared without a trace. No one had seen him leave, no one could explain where he went. And there were other articles from other nearby towns. Similar stories, different hotels, but the details were the same. A man in a hoodie, sitting in the lobby, watching. Guests disappearing, never to be seen again. The realization hit me slowly, creeping in as the rain continued to beat against the window. This wasn't just some strange guest. This man, he was stalking people. And I was next. I packed up my things and checked out as quickly as I could. The rain was relentless, pounding against the pavement as I loaded my car, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. I told Tom I was leaving early, and he didn't seem to care, barely looking up from his phone. But just as I was about to leave, I saw him again. The man in the hoodie, standing by the entrance to the lobby, watching. His face was still hidden, but there was something in the way he stood, something knowing. I drove to the nearest police station, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as I tried to think of the right words to say. When I got there, I told them everything. The footsteps, the knocking, the way he stood outside my door in the middle of the night. They listened, taking notes, but I could tell from their faces that they'd heard similar stories before. The officer told me they were looking into it, that they'd had other reports about a man matching that description. But they didn't have enough to go on. Not yet. It's been months now, and I still check the news sometimes, hoping to hear that they've caught him, that they've finally figured out who he is. But so far, nothing. People are still disappearing. Hotels just like the one I stayed in, guests vanishing without a trace. I can't stay in hotels anymore. Every time I step into a lobby, I see that man in the corner of my mind, sitting there waiting, watching. And I know he's still out there, somewhere. It was a chilly autumn evening when I first noticed the change in Daniel. Our house sat on the edge of town, not much different from any other place around here. Quiet, modest, filled with the sounds of life and routine. Until recently, the day it all began, I was cleaning the kitchen while Daniel was upstairs in his room. He had been quieter than usual these past few weeks, but I didn't think much of it. Teenagers go through phases. They withdraw. They get moody. Still, something about the silence that evening made me pause. It wasn't the usual quiet of a child lost in his thoughts or the silence of homework being done. There was something else, a stillness, as if the life had been sucked out of the house entirely. I called up to him, just a simple, "Daniel, dinner will be ready soon," but there was no response. Not a sound from upstairs. I called again, louder this time, expecting him to at least grunt or say, "I'll be down in a minute," like he always did. But again, nothing. I headed up the stairs, my shoes tapping lightly on the wooden steps, the only noise in the house. His door was shut, and there was no movement behind it. No rustling of paper, no sound of him shifting in his chair. I knocked softly, still trying not to disturb him too much. "Daniel?" I asked, my voice just loud enough. When he didn't respond, I opened the door. He was sitting on the bed, staring at the wall, just staring, like he wasn't really there. "Daniel?" I said again, stepping into the room, but he didn't move. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Not yet. I asked him if everything was okay. He nodded but didn't say a word. Just sat there, eyes blank, unfocused. It was strange, but I brushed it off. Figured he had a bad day at school. Maybe he was tired. Teenagers, they're unpredictable. You can never quite tell what's going on in their heads. Still, the image of him sitting like that lingered in my mind for the rest of the evening. That night, I heard him talking in his room. Low, muffled words. But I assumed he was on the phone. Even though Daniel rarely had friends over or called anyone, it seemed like the only explanation. I went to bed thinking it was nothing. But that image of him, sitting there, staring at the wall, stayed with me. The strange occurrences began to pile up in the days that followed. Daniel's mood grew darker, his temper shorter. He began muttering to himself more often, not just at night, but in broad daylight too. Sometimes I'd catch him in the middle of the living room, standing still, whispering something I couldn't understand. The first time it happened, I asked him what he was saying, and he just shrugged. Told me it was nothing, but I could have sworn I heard the same phrase more than once. Something that sounded like a prayer, or a chant. It wasn't long before I started noticing other things around the house too. Objects moved. Small things like keys or utensils left in odd places. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness, but it kept happening. More than once, I found things scattered around Daniel's room, like his belongings had been thrown about in a fit of rage. When I asked him about it, he seemed confused, like he didn't remember doing it. I noticed the bruises shortly after that. Dark splotches on his arms and wrists. When I asked where they came from, he avoided eye contact, mumbling something about bumping into things. Accidents, he said. But the bruises were too deliberate, too distinct. They looked like they came from something. Someone grabbing him. At night, the whispers from his room grew louder, more insistent. I'd stand outside his door, trying to listen, but it never made sense. His voice would rise and fall, sometimes harsh, sometimes soft, but it never sounded like my son. The nights were the worst. Once, I woke up to the sound of him screaming in his room, a horrible, guttural noise that made my skin crawl. I ran to his door, but by the time I got there, he was sitting on his bed, silent again. I asked what happened, and he just looked at me, eyes wide, but empty. No explanation. That was when I began to wonder. Could something else be happening? Something beyond my understanding? It was getting worse, much worse. Daniel had become unpredictable, violent even. There was a night I'll never forget, one that made everything feel too real. I heard a crash from his room, like something heavy had been thrown against the wall. I rushed in, only to find Daniel standing in the middle of the room, panting heavily, his chest rising and falling like he'd been running a marathon. His lamp was shattered on the floor, the bed covers ripped, paper scattered everywhere. He was gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles were white. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling without my control. He looked at me, eyes wild, like he didn't recognize me. "It's here," he whispered. "I can feel it inside me." I didn't know what to say. I felt utterly helpless. I tried to stop it, but it won't leave me alone. That was when I knew I had to do something. Anything. I called our pastor the next morning, explained everything as best as I could, though the words felt strange coming out of my mouth. He listened patiently, and when I was done, he didn't hesitate. "This is spiritual warfare," he said. "I've seen it before. I'll come over tomorrow, we'll pray together." I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just sit and watch my son slip further away from me. The pastor arrived that evening, carrying his Bible and anointing oil. Daniel was in his room, quieter than he'd been all day, which somehow made it worse. The pastor began to pray, his voice strong and steady, filling the room with the words of Scripture. But Daniel didn't react. Not at first. Then slowly he began to twitch, his body convulsing, as if something inside him was fighting to get out. The pastor continued, undeterred. I stood by, clutching a rosary, watching my son writhe on the floor. His voice, it changed, deepened. Something inside him growled and hissed. I felt a cold rush of fear, unlike anything I'd ever felt before. The exorcism didn't work, at least not in the way I thought it would. Daniel didn't improve. If anything, he got worse. He became more detached, more unresponsive, barely spoke a word to me anymore. I called the pastor again, but he insisted that the process had worked, that Daniel was just recovering. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was wrong. That's when my friend Susan came to visit. She was a nurse, practical, level-headed. I told her everything about Daniel's strange behavior, the bruises, the voices. She listened quietly, nodding. But when I mentioned the exorcism, she stopped me. "Have you taken him to a doctor?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. It hadn't even occurred to me. Maybe it's not what you think," she continued, carefully choosing her words. I resisted at first, convinced that this was beyond medicine, beyond anything earthly. But Susan persisted. She made me promise to take Daniel to the hospital, to get him evaluated. The doctors ran tests, talked to him for hours, asked him questions I hadn't even thought to ask. When they finally came back to me, their faces were grave. "Your son isn't possessed," one of them said gently. "He's suffering from schizophrenia." The words hit me harder than I could have imagined. Schizophrenia. I felt the weight of it settle over me, the reality sinking in. I'd been so focused on the idea of possession, of demons and spirits, that I hadn't seen the truth staring me in the face. Daniel was sick, mentally ill, not haunted by anything supernatural, but by his own mind. The doctors explained everything, the delusions, the voices, the violent outbursts. They'd been symptoms all along, but I'd been too blinded by my own beliefs to recognize them. Daniel was placed in a psychiatric facility shortly after that. The damage from his untreated illness was severe. The medications helped, but not enough, not fast enough. I visited him as often as I could, but he was never quite the same, never the boy I remembered. The guilt weighed on me every day, the knowledge that I could have helped him sooner if I hadn't been so focused on the wrong things. The house felt empty without him, cold and hollow. I still hear the occasional whisper late at night, the creak of a floorboard or a rustle in the hall. But now I know it's not spirits, not demons, just the echoes of my own mistakes. The sounds of a home that lost something it will never get back. It had been one of those weeks where everything at work felt like an endless grind. Emails, phone calls, meetings, all of it blending into a haze of monotony that I needed to shake off. That's how I found myself driving out to the old trailhead on a cool October evening. I wasn't what you'd call an adventure seeker, but hiking had always given me a break from the chaos. There was something peaceful about being out in the wilderness with just the sound of my boots crunching on dirt. I'd been to this trail before, but not in years. Back then, it was the place where local kids would dare each other to go after dark, whispering about ghosts and weird disappearances. I always figured it was just a story to keep people from going too deep into the woods. But tonight, the stories crossed my mind again. The weather was perfect for hiking, with a light mist hanging in the air, just enough to make the trees look taller, more imposing. I parked the car, grabbed my backpack, and set out on the path, feeling the familiar pull of the forest drawing me in. The trail was narrow, winding through dense trees that towered overhead, blocking out most of the fading daylight. I followed the main path for a good while, enjoying the quiet and solitude. But as I walked, I started noticing something odd. There was a smaller trail cutting off from the main one, partially hidden by thick underbrush. It looked old, maybe forgotten, but definitely walked on recently. Curiosity got the better of me. Without really thinking, I veered off the main trail and followed this new one, deeper into the woods. The farther I walked, the more the forest seemed to change around me. The trees felt closer together, their branches tangled in strange shapes. The mist thickened, clinging to the ground in strange, swirling patterns that seemed to move with me. I hadn't seen another hiker all day, which wasn't unusual for a weekday evening. But now it started to feel off. I kept walking, though, driven by something I couldn't quite put into words. That's when I noticed the first shelter. It was small, built from branches and leaves, almost blending into the forest floor. It looked abandoned, like someone had hastily thrown it together and left it to rot. I knelt down to examine it, but there was nothing inside, just a few scraps of fabric and some old, torn-up plastic bags. Weird, but probably just the remnants of some overambitious camper, I figured. Still, something didn't sit right about it. I stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and kept going, not quite ready to turn back. Not yet. As I ventured further down the trail, the trees grew more twisted, gnarled, like something out of a fairy tale gone wrong. There was a distinct feeling that I was entering a part of the forest that didn't get many visitors. The path became less obvious, as if the forest was trying to swallow it up. I passed another shelter, then another. Each one more hastily constructed than the last, and each one abandoned. There was a pattern to them, though, a kind of deliberate spacing that felt too calculated for random campers. As I studied the crude huts, I noticed something else. Carvings on the trees. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable marks, but they became more intricate the deeper I went. They weren't like any symbols I'd seen before, just rough scratches, almost like warnings, though I couldn't figure out what they were warning against. I took out my phone, snapping a few pictures. Maybe I'd look them up later, try to make sense of it all. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Someone or something was moving through the trees, just out of sight. I stopped walking and listened. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to shrug it off, I saw movement in the corner of my eye. A figure darted between the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just the sense of something or someone being there watching. I called out, but there was no response. Maybe it was another hiker, maybe not. I couldn't tell. But the idea of someone else being out here hiding in the trees didn't sit well with me. I kept moving, faster this time, trying to put some distance between me and whatever or whoever it was. The trail twisted and turned, but I could still feel eyes on me, even if I couldn't see who or what was watching. I came to a clearing suddenly, the trees parting like they'd been pushed aside by invisible hands. In the center stood a cluster of larger huts, more like makeshift cabins. They weren't abandoned, though. I could tell by the way the ground was worn around them, by the way tools and supplies were stacked neatly outside. I wasn't alone anymore. I froze, scanning the area for signs of life, but saw no one. That's when I heard the sound. A low, rhythmic drumming coming from somewhere nearby. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It sent a chill through me, though I wasn't sure why. I moved cautiously toward one of the huts, peeking inside. Empty. But there was something off about the way it was arranged, like it had been lived in, recently. That's when I saw them. Two figures standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. They were dressed in ragged clothing, their faces smeared with dirt or something worse. They didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. I tried to back away slowly, but the drumming grew louder, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. The figures took a step forward, and then another. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. Branches slapped against my face and arms as I tore through the forest, the drumming still pounding in my ears. I didn't stop running until I couldn't hear it anymore. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, I realized I had no idea where I was. I'd lost the trail. The trees seemed to close in around me, and I felt more lost than ever. The forest was silent now, unnervingly so. That's when I saw it. A piece of paper pinned to a tree with a crude, hand-carved knife. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest as I read the words scrawled across it. "You've gone too far." The words felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some random group of campers. This was a warning, and I was in their territory. I started piecing it together, the shelters, the symbols, the strange figures watching me from the trees. This wasn't some haunted forest. This was something else entirely. A group of people, survivalists maybe, or something worse, living off the grid, using the stories of the haunted woods to keep people away. And I had stumbled right into the middle of it. I turned, ready to run again, when I heard a voice behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I whipped around, and there he was, one of the figures from the clearing, standing just a few feet away. He looked rough, dirty clothes, sunken eyes, and a strange calm about him, like he wasn't surprised to see me here. Like he'd been expecting me. I don't know how I made it out of that forest. I don't remember running or the way I stumbled back onto the main trail, my legs aching from exhaustion. But somehow, I did. I made it back to my car, back to the safety of the road, and drove straight home without looking back. I called the authorities as soon as I could, told them everything. About the huts, the symbols, the people living out there. They said they'd look into it, but I could tell they didn't believe me. To them, it was just another tall tale about the haunted forest. But I knew the truth. I could still hear that drumming in my head, still see the look in that man's eyes when he told me I didn't belong there. I haven't gone back to that forest since. I still think about it though, especially when the weather turns cool and the mist starts rolling in. Part of me wonders if they're still out there, hiding in those woods, waiting for the next unlucky hiker to wander too far. And every now and then I check my phone. I still have the pictures of those strange carvings, the ones no one else seems to believe are real. But I know what I saw, and I know what's still out there. It was a typical Monday evening when the moving truck pulled up next door. The weather was drizzly, the kind of slow, persistent rain that made everything feel damp. I was out back, putting the recycling bins by the curb when I noticed the new neighbors for the first time. They were unloading furniture from the truck, just the two of them, no movers, no help from anyone in the neighborhood. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy jacket despite the mild temperature, and the woman looked small next to him, wrapped in an oversized coat that seemed to swallow her whole. They didn't greet me, didn't even glance in my direction. I found that odd, but didn't think too much of it at the time. Maybe they were just private people, the kind who preferred to keep to themselves. Still, it wasn't like our neighborhood to not at least wave or say hello, especially when someone new moved in. By the time I went back inside, the truck had driven away, and their front door had already closed. My wife, Lisa, asked me if I had met the new neighbors, and I told her no. They seemed quiet, I said, shrugging it off. But something about them lingered in my mind, a feeling I couldn't quite put my finger on. Later that night, after dinner, I noticed something strange from our living room window. The couple's house was completely dark, no lights on, no sign of life, as if they weren't even there. I assumed they'd gone to bed early or were just settling in, but I caught myself staring at the darkened windows longer than I meant to. That was when I first noticed the faint flicker of light. It was quick, barely noticeable, but there, a brief flash like a camera going off from inside their house. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was probably just a reflection from the streetlights, but something about it felt off. I turned away from the window and tried to shake it from my mind, but it stayed with me for the rest of the evening. The rain continued through the night, soft but steady, adding to the odd feeling that had settled over me. By the time I went to bed, I couldn't help but wonder what kind of people moved into a neighborhood like ours and didn't even introduce themselves. Days passed, and the couple remained as much of a mystery as they were on the day they moved in. They kept their curtains drawn, their lights off, and came and went only at night. It was a routine I couldn't help but notice, not because I was nosy, but because they seemed so deliberately invisible. Every evening, just as the rain began to taper off, their car would pull out of the driveway around the same time. They'd return hours later after midnight, slipping into the house without a sound. I started watching from my window without really meaning to. I'd find myself standing there, looking out at the street, waiting for their car to pull away or return. It became a strange ritual for me, almost like I was waiting for something to happen. And then, one evening, something did. I saw a group of people walking toward their house, 5 or 6 of them, all dressed in dark clothing. They didn't knock on the door, didn't ring the bell. Instead, they stood in the rain for a moment before the door quietly opened, and they slipped inside. No words were exchanged, no greetings, just a silent entrance, as if they were expected. My gut told me this wasn't right, but I didn't know why. I stood there for a while, expecting to see the people leave, but they didn't. Hours passed, and there was no sign of them. I wanted to talk to Lisa about it, but she was already asleep, and I didn't want to sound paranoid. The next morning, when I looked at the house again, there was no trace of anything unusual. The couple's car was back, their curtains still closed, and the street was empty. But the image of those silent figures disappearing into their house stayed with me. I tried to brush it off, tell myself it was nothing, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. That night, I found myself standing at the window again, waiting for something I couldn't explain. By now, I couldn't deny that something strange was happening next door. It wasn't just their odd schedule or the lack of lights in the house. It was the fact that every night, more people seemed to show up, slipping in and out like ghosts. It was always late, always when the rain was falling the hardest, and always without a sound. It didn't make sense. What kind of people had this many visitors at night, but no one ever stayed for long? I decided to take a walk one evening, just to see if I could get a closer look. It was raining again, of course, and I made sure to keep my distance as I circled the block, heading toward their house from the opposite direction. Their car was gone as usual, and I figured they were out for the night. But as I approached, I saw the faint flicker of lights inside again, like flashes from a camera, though I knew it couldn't be that. I paused at the corner, half hidden by a tree, and waited. It didn't take long before I saw them. A group of men, maybe 6 or 7 this time, walking toward the house. Just like before, they didn't knock. The door opened without a sound, and they slipped inside. But this time I noticed something different. One of them was carrying a large duffel bag slung over his shoulder, the kind you'd see someone use for a long trip or to carry heavy equipment. I had no idea what was inside, but the sight of it made me pause. For the first time, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I didn't want to see. I waited a little longer, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was going on inside, but the curtains remained tightly drawn. I turned back toward home, rain dripping down the back of my neck, but my mind was spinning with questions. Whatever was happening in that house, it wasn't normal. The next night, I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was going on. I waited until the couple left, the rain falling harder than ever, before making my move. I grabbed a flashlight and slipped out the back door, telling myself it was just to ease my curiosity. The house was dark, as usual, and the street was empty. I made my way across their lawn, careful to stay out of sight, and approached one of the windows at the side of the house. The blinds were drawn, but there was a small gap near the top where I could just barely see inside. I stood on my toes and peered in. What I saw made my blood freeze. Inside there were cages, large metal cages lined up against the wall, and inside them were people. Men and women huddled together, gagged and bound, their eyes wide with fear. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It wasn't possible. How could this be happening right next door? I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just barge in there, and I sure as hell couldn't confront them. For the first time in my life, I felt completely helpless. I rushed back to my house, locking the door behind me, and grabbed my phone. I knew I had to call the police, but part of me was terrified of what would happen if they found out I had seen them. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the phone in my hand, but I knew I couldn't just leave those people there. The police arrived quickly, their lights flashing in the rain, but they didn't make a scene. They moved quietly, cautiously, surrounding the house while I watched from my living room window. It felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. I saw them enter the house, heard the muffled sounds of shouting, and then the rain seemed to swallow everything. They emerged a while later, leading out the people I had seen in the cages, along with several men in handcuffs. But the couple wasn't among them. I learned later that they had slipped away before the police arrived, vanishing into the night like they had never been there. The people they had kept in the house were victims of human trafficking, smuggled in and out under the cover of night. I couldn't believe it had happened right under my nose. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The couple was still out there somewhere, and I couldn't help but wonder if they'd come back. Every night, I checked the locks on my doors, made sure the windows were shut tight, but I knew that no amount of security would ease the unease that had settled over me. And then, one morning, I found something on my porch. It was a small envelope, unmarked, with nothing inside but a single photograph. A picture of my house, taken from the street in the middle of the night. The couple was still out there, and they hadn't forgotten me. I'll never forget the day it all started. It was a rainy Wednesday, the kind of day where everything felt slow, muted, like the world itself was groggy. I was sitting at my desk in the office, scrolling through endless emails, when Karen walked by and flashed me a quick smile. There was nothing strange about that smile, at least not at first. Karen was someone I'd never really paid much attention to. She was quiet, reserved, and kept to herself most of the time. But every now and then, she'd join us for coffee or make small talk at the copier. Months ago, I remembered her joking with a few of us about her interest in tarot readings and crystals. She called it witchy stuff and laughed like it was nothing serious, just a fun hobby. At the time, I shrugged it off, like everyone else. But lately, things hadn't been going so well for me at work. First, I started misplacing files that I knew I had saved. Then my computer would freeze randomly, and IT couldn't figure out what was wrong. Even small things, like my chair being slightly off or my coffee cup disappearing, began to irritate me. I started to wonder if I was just overworked or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I overheard Karen talking to another colleague about spells. She was casually mentioning something about a binding spell, and while they both laughed, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that followed. That evening, as I was leaving the office, the rain poured harder, almost drowning out the sound of the city streets. I headed home, trying to forget the unsettling conversation, but as I climbed into bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About Karen's smile, her interest in witchy things, and how odd she'd been acting lately. Something wasn't right, and I could feel it, even though I couldn't explain it. The next few days were a blur of more odd occurrences. At work, my files went missing again, and this time it was worse. Important documents, ones I needed for a presentation, vanished without a trace. I tore my desk apart, searching every drawer, but they were gone. I had no choice but to go to my boss, apologizing for my mistake, even though I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. Karen was there when I explained the situation. She didn't say a word, just stood in the corner, quietly observing as if she were waiting for something. It felt like she knew something I didn't, and it made my skin crawl. Later, I found a small black feather sitting on my desk. I brushed it aside, thinking it was some random thing that had blown in through an open window. But deep down, it bothered me. Each day after that, more feathers appeared, always on my desk, always in the same spot. I mentioned it to Lisa, my closest friend at work, but she laughed it off, saying it was probably a pigeon nesting near the air vent. Her explanation made sense, but I couldn't shake the growing feeling that something more sinister was going on. The final straw came one afternoon when my computer crashed during a meeting with our department head. Everything I had been working on for weeks was wiped clean, and I had no backup. I sat there, humiliated as everyone stared at me. Karen sat in the back of the room, her face unreadable, but I swear I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It was as if she was enjoying my downfall. After that meeting, I couldn't stop thinking about Karen. Her witchy hobbies, the way things around me were slowly falling apart, and those damn feathers. I knew it sounded crazy, but part of me was starting to believe she had something to do with all of it. One night, after another frustrating day at work, I found myself sitting in my living room, staring at the rain streaming down the window. I was exhausted, mentally and physically. Everything felt off, like I was trapped in a loop of bad luck and stress. I couldn't let it go anymore. I needed answers, and I was going to get them. The next morning, I waited until most people had left the office for lunch. Karen was still at her desk, typing away, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I walked over, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what I was even going to say. "Karen," I started, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. "Can I talk to you for a second?" She looked up, her expression blank, and nodded. We stepped into one of the small conference rooms, and I closed the door behind us. "I need to ask you something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Are you doing something to me?" Her eyes flicked up, and for a second I thought I saw a smile tug at the corner of her lips. "What do you mean?" she asked innocently, but there was something off in the way she said it. I could feel my frustration boiling over. "Don't play dumb," I snapped, louder than I meant to. "Ever since you started talking about your spells and whatever else, my life's been falling apart. Are you cursing me?" There, I had said it. Karen just stared at me for a moment, then burst out laughing. "Are you serious?" she asked, wiping away an imaginary tear. "You think I'm cursing you?" Her laughter sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't back down. "You know something," I said, my voice quieter now, but full of conviction. "And I'm going to find out what it is." She didn't say anything after that, just watched me as I walked out of the room. But that smile lingered on her face long after I was gone. After that confrontation, things only got worse. My work performance continued to decline, no matter how hard I tried. Emails went missing, documents were altered, and my boss started to lose patience with me. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, going over everything that had happened, a realization hit me. Karen wasn't cursing me. She was sabotaging me. I couldn't believe I hadn't seen it before. I started piecing it all together. She had access to my files, to the shared work documents. She could have easily been altering them or deleting things from my computer. The black feathers, the strange occurrences, they weren't supernatural, they were psychological. She was playing mind games, and I had fallen for it. The next day, I did some digging. I checked the login records for the shared drive, and sure enough, Karen had been accessing my documents late at night, long after I had logged off. I confronted Lisa about it, and she admitted she had noticed Karen acting strangely, but didn't want to alarm me without proof. Together, we took the evidence to HR. Karen was gone within a week. HR didn't make a big deal out of it, just quietly let her go with a severance package. I thought that would be the end of it, but something still felt wrong. Even after Karen was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I opened my desk drawer and found a single black feather. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if it was just my imagination or if Karen had somehow left one last message for me. I never found out. But to this day, every time I see a black feather, I think of Karen, and I wonder if she ever really let go. I hadn't seen Martin in months when I found that painting at the flea market. The day was overcast, the kind of gloomy gray that hangs in the air and never quite turns into rain. I wasn't looking for anything special, just passing the time, wandering through the crowded stalls. Then, tucked away behind a stack of old books, I noticed it. A painting, old and worn, propped up against a table. It was a portrait of a man, his face partially in shadow, with eyes that seemed too focused, too sharp for the rest of the blurred figure. I'm not someone who buys into superstition, but there was something about that painting that caught me off guard. Something about the way those eyes seemed to follow you wherever you stood. The seller was an older woman, her wrinkled face breaking into a grin when I asked about it. "Haunted, or so they say," she chuckled, like she didn't take it seriously. Apparently, the previous owner claimed it ruined his life, drove him mad, but she waved it off like it was just another sales pitch. I wasn't superstitious, but the story intrigued me. Plus, the price was cheap, and I figured it'd be a good conversation starter for my apartment. When I got home, I hung it in the living room, right above the fireplace where it dominated the wall. I stepped back, looking at it in place, thinking how it added something to the room, despite how odd it felt to have it there. The man's eyes seemed even sharper now, like they followed me with more intensity. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination, just a trick of the light. That night, the rain finally started, light at first, tapping against the windows as I settled into my chair with a book. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop glancing up at the painting. Something about it bothered me, even though I couldn't quite explain why. It wasn't like the painting moved or anything like that, but those eyes, they seemed so alive. I called Martin the next day, not for any reason really, just to check in like I was supposed to. Our conversations were always brief, and this one was no different. We hadn't been close since our parents died. Things had been tense between us ever since, but we pretended like nothing was wrong, both too stubborn to talk about it. When I mentioned the painting and how it was supposedly haunted, Martin just scoffed, saying, "That sounds like something you'd fall for." I hung up shortly after that, feeling more alone than I had before. A few days later, I started noticing little things around the apartment that didn't make sense. It wasn't anything major at first, just small, almost insignificant details. A chair slightly out of place, a book on the floor that I swore I'd left on the table. I told myself I was just being forgetful, brushing it off like it was nothing, but it kept happening. And every time I'd catch something out of the ordinary, I'd find myself glancing at that painting. The man's eyes seemed more intense, like he was watching me closer, judging me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a stupid painting, but the feeling stuck with me. The rain continued for days, always pattering against the windows, making the whole apartment feel heavier, darker. At night, I'd lie in bed and think about the painting, about how ridiculous it was to feel uneasy about something so trivial. But I couldn't shake it. I kept catching myself staring at it, waiting for something to happen, even though I knew nothing would. It was just a painting, just a stupid painting. One night, I was woken up by the sound of creaking floorboards, like someone was walking through the hallway. I lay there, listening, but the sound stopped as soon as I noticed it. I got up to check the apartment, but everything was as it should be. Except for the painting. It felt different, like the man in the portrait was standing closer to the frame, though I knew that wasn't possible. I called Martin again, more for distraction than anything else, and told him about the strange things happening. He laughed, of course, and said I was probably losing it, but there was something in his tone that felt off. It wasn't just mockery. It was something more, something cold and distant. He didn't stay on the phone long, and when he hung up, I was left with that same heavy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The rain was falling harder now, almost drowning out the silence in the apartment, but not quite. I went to bed that night, trying not to think about the painting, trying to pretend it wasn't there, but I couldn't. By the third week, I was starting to feel like I couldn't get away from it. The painting was always there, in the back of my mind, no matter what I was doing. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the man in the painting was watching my every move. Every time I left the room, I'd find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting him to be right behind me. I moved the painting to the spare bedroom, thinking that would help, but it didn't. It was worse, if anything. Even though it wasn't in my living room anymore, I could still feel it, like it was lurking just beyond the door. I'd walk past the spare room and swear I heard something. A faint scraping sound, like fingernails on wood. It got to the point where I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning every night, thinking about that damn painting. I decided to set up a camera in the spare room, just to prove to myself that nothing was happening. The rain was back, heavier than before, as I set the camera up, feeling foolish for even doing it. But I needed to know. I left the camera running overnight, and the next morning, I reviewed the footage, expecting to see nothing. But there was something, a shadow, faint but unmistakable, moving across the room. It stopped right in front of the painting, lingering there for a moment before disappearing. I played it back over and over, trying to figure out what I was looking at, but the shadow was there every time. I called Martin, my voice shaking as I told him he had to come over, that I needed him to see something. When he arrived, I showed him the footage, waiting for him to react. But he just stared at it like he didn't see what I saw. "Maybe it's a trick of the light," he said, shrugging like it didn't matter. but I knew he saw it. He left not long after, and the apartment felt colder, emptier, like the walls were closing in on me. It wasn't until a few days later that everything started to make sense. I had been obsessing over the footage, replaying it again and again, trying to figure out what that shadow was. It moved in a way that felt familiar, though I couldn't place why at first. And then it hit me. The way the shadow moved, the way it paused in front of the painting, it reminded me of Martin. I felt sick as I replayed the footage one more time, slower this time, watching the shadow move exactly the way Martin always did. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more everything started to fall into place. Martin had been acting strange, distant, too distant. I searched the apartment, desperate to find some kind of explanation, and that's when I found it. In the attic, hidden behind some old boxes, was a small black device. A camera. Martin had been watching me. He had been in my apartment, setting things up, messing with my head. All those strange occurrences, all the little things that didn't make sense, they were all him. I felt like an idiot for not seeing it sooner. Martin was trying to drive me crazy, trying to push me over the edge. And I knew why. The inheritance. If I was declared unfit, he'd get everything. I confronted Martin the next day, and he didn't even bother denying it. He just smirked, like it was all a game to him. "You always were too easy," he said, leaning back in his chair like he didn't have a care in the world. I wanted to hit him, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. He had already won. I went to the police, but without solid evidence of his manipulation, there wasn't much they could do. The camera I found wasn't enough to prove what he had been doing, and without proof, there was no case. Martin got away with it. He got what he wanted, and I was left with nothing. The inheritance was split, but that didn't matter. He had broken me. I moved out of that apartment, leaving the painting behind, thinking I could start over. But a few weeks later, a package arrived at my new place, no return address. Inside was the painting, wrapped in brown paper with a note tucked into the frame. "You'll never escape." I stared at it, not sure if it was Martin or something else, but one thing was clear. The nightmare wasn't over. It was a quiet October evening when I first came across the crossroads. I had just moved to this small town, looking for a fresh start after everything in the city fell apart. Most of the folks here didn't seem to have much to say beyond the usual pleasantries, but they were nice enough. There was something about the place, though, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The town itself was surrounded by thick forests, broken only by long stretches of empty road. The one spot that seemed to get the most attention was an old intersection just on the outskirts of town, the crossroads. I'd heard the stories from the locals, how no one ventured there at night, how people swore they saw strange things. They called it cursed, but that didn't mean much to me. I wasn't superstitious, just curious. The first time I drove past the crossroads, it was raining. The kind of rain that made it hard to see anything more than a few feet ahead. That's when I noticed it. A figure standing right at the center of the intersection. It wasn't moving, just there, as if waiting for something. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the rain blurred everything. When I looked again, the figure was gone. Part of me wanted to chalk it up to the weather playing tricks on my eyes. But another part of me wondered if maybe there was something more to it. I kept driving, not sure what to think, but that image of the figure stuck with me for days. It wasn't until later that I learned about the supposed cult that gathered at the crossroads. The rumors were hard to avoid. At the diner, in the grocery store, even at the gas station, everyone seemed to have a story. People talked about seeing robed figures in the dead of night, chanting in languages no one could understand. Others claimed they heard strange sounds, saw fires, or even witnessed rituals. I didn't believe any of it at first. In fact, I thought the whole thing sounded ridiculous, like something out of a bad horror movie. But the more I heard, the more I couldn't help but wonder if there was something real behind all the talk. After all, every rumor has some kernel of truth, right? One evening, after hearing yet another creepy tale from my neighbor Edna, I decided to see the crossroads for myself. Just once, I thought. What harm could it do? The next week, I drove out to the crossroads again. This time, I went intentionally, just to put my curiosity to rest. It was another rainy night, heavy drops smacking against the windshield, making everything look blurry and distorted. The road was nearly empty, and the further I got from town, the darker it became. I wasn't expecting to see anything out of the ordinary, but part of me hoped I would. When I reached the crossroads, I slowed the car and pulled over. There was nothing there. No figures, no chanting, no fires. Just the quiet, soaked road stretching out into the night. I felt a bit foolish for expecting something dramatic. Still, I decided to step out of the car. The rain had let up a little, enough for me to make out the ground clearly. I wandered closer to the center of the crossroads. The asphalt was cracked, with small patches of weeds forcing their way through the splits. That's when I saw something strange. In the middle of the road, there were markings, faint but definitely there. I knelt down to get a better look. It was some kind of symbol, drawn into the dirt with what looked like ash. I had no idea what it meant, but it was definitely deliberate. I stood up, looking around, feeling a little unsettled for the first time. Who had drawn this, and why? It wasn't the kind of thing that just appeared on its own. I glanced back at my car, ready to leave, but something caught my eye. At the edge of the crossroads, half hidden in the grass, was a small, worn-out shoe. I couldn't explain it, but seeing that shoe felt wrong somehow. I didn't know what to make of it, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I hurried back to my car and drove home, my mind racing with questions. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the shoe, the symbol. None of it made sense, but I knew I had to figure out what was going on. It wasn't long before I made up my mind. I was going back to the crossroads, and this time, I was going to stay longer. The following Saturday night, I returned to the crossroads. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still overcast and the roads were slick. This time, I wasn't just driving by. I parked at a distance and walked the rest of the way. The air felt heavy, like something was about to happen. I made my way back to the center of the intersection, flashlight in hand. The markings were still there, though they looked a little more faded now. The shoe was gone. I don't know what I was expecting, but I knew that whatever was going on here wasn't just a coincidence. I stood there for a while, just listening. That's when I heard it, chanting. Faint at first, but growing louder as I strained to hear it. I whipped my flashlight around, trying to see where the sound was coming from. Then, from the shadows, figures emerged. 4 people, all wearing dark robes, moving slowly toward the crossroads. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They didn't seem to notice me at first, but I didn't want to stick around long enough for that to change. Just as I was about to make a run for it, one of the figures broke away from the group and started walking toward me. I froze, unsure of what to do. The figure stopped just a few feet away, standing silently. It didn't say anything, but its presence was enough to make me want to turn and leave. I stepped back, ready to bolt, but before I could, the figure raised its arm and pointed to the ground near my feet. I looked down. There was another symbol, fresh this time, and something else. A large sack, tied tightly with rope. I didn't want to know what was inside. Without another word, I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart racing. What had I just seen? The next morning, I went straight to the police. I didn't tell them about the chanting or the symbols. I just told them what I'd seen. A group of people in robes and a sack left at the crossroads. At first, they didn't take me seriously. They said it was probably just kids playing pranks. But when I mentioned the shoe and the sack, they got quiet. It turned out there had been a series of disappearances in the area. People who had gone missing without a trace. The shoe I found matched the description of a little girl who had vanished a few months ago. Detective Lisa, the officer in charge, started looking into the case more closely. She told me that there had been rumors of a trafficking ring operating in the area, using the crossroads as a meeting point. The cult was just a cover, a way to scare people away and keep them from looking too closely. Everything clicked into place. The rituals, the symbols, the chanting, it was all a ruse to hide something far more sinister. The sack I saw, it was likely filled with supplies, or worse, someone being transported. It made sense now, but that didn't make it any easier to stomach. A few weeks later, the police raided a house not far from the crossroads. They found the people responsible, a gang trafficking humans. They'd been using the crossroads as a staging ground, using the cult rumors to scare off anyone who got too curious. It was all over the news, but for some reason, the town still felt quiet, like everyone was trying to pretend nothing had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, that the people involved weren't done yet. Every time I drove by the crossroads, I remembered the figures in the rain, the shoe, the chanting. I knew the police had caught the gang, but that didn't stop the images from replaying in my head. I tried not to think about it, but it was hard not to. One day, months later, I was driving past the crossroads again. For some reason, I slowed down, glancing toward the center of the intersection. There, on the side of the road, was another symbol, freshly drawn into the dirt. I didn't stop. I didn't want to know, but as I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder. Was it really over, or was something still waiting in the shadows? We moved into the house on a rainy evening, the kind of rain that made everything feel still. It was an old place, built back in the 50s, with all the charm and character of a bygone era. Wooden floors that creaked with every step, tall windows that rattled when the wind blew too hard, and a front porch that looked like it had seen better days. But we loved it. It was a new start for us, a fresh beginning after a string of hard times. My wife Sarah had found the place online, and I remember thinking it was too good to be true. Spacious, affordable, in a quiet neighborhood. What more could we ask for? The first night we were unpacking boxes when the rain started coming down harder. You could hear it drumming on the roof, a steady rhythm that felt almost soothing. Sarah had gone to bed early, exhausted from the move, but I stayed up, trying to organize some of the living room. That's when I heard it. A voice. Faint, almost a whisper, coming from down the hall. At first I thought it was the rain playing tricks on me, but then it came again, clearer this time. It sounded like a child, calling out. I paused, listening, trying to place it. The voice seemed to come from the walls, from the air around me. Please, help me. I stood still, waiting for it to happen again, but nothing followed. Just the steady sound of rain. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was my imagination or a sound from outside. After all, the house was old. Maybe it just needed some time to settle. But that voice, it stayed with me, even as I climbed into bed later that night. Sarah was already asleep, her breathing steady, unaware of the strange occurrence I had just experienced. The rain kept pouring down, lulling me into a fitful sleep, but the memory of that voice lingered in the back of my mind. The days went by, and we started to settle in, but something about the house felt off. Every night, around the same time, I would hear that voice again. Sometimes it was soft, barely more than a whisper. Other times, it was louder, clearer, as though the child was standing right outside our bedroom door. Please, I'm lost. Help me. It was always the same words, the same pleading tone. Sarah hadn't noticed anything strange. She was too busy with work and adjusting to our new life. But I couldn't shake it. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, I decided to investigate. I walked through the house, moving from room to room, trying to find the source of the sound. It always seemed to come from just beyond where I was standing, as though it were leading me somewhere. I checked the windows, thinking maybe it was coming from outside. But the street was empty, just the rain tapping against the glass. I even stood in the hall, listening carefully, but there was nothing. Just silence. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the voice again. It was louder this time, more desperate. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. Please, I'm right here. Help me. I got out of bed, determined to figure out what was going on. I searched every corner of the house, feeling more and more frustrated. Nothing. There was nothing there. but I knew what I'd heard. By the end of the second week, the voice had become a regular occurrence. Every night, at almost the exact same time, it would start again. I began to dread the evenings, knowing that as soon as the house grew quiet, the voice would return. I didn't want to tell Sarah. I didn't want her to think I was losing it. But the voice was so clear, so real. One night, I decided to record it. I set up my phone and left it running while I waited for the voice to appear. Sure enough, around 2 a.m., I heard it. That same plea for help, the same childlike tone. I rushed to my phone, eager to hear the recording. But when I played it back, there was nothing, just the sound of rain tapping against the windows. No voice, no child, just silence. I replayed it over and over, but every time it was the same. I couldn't believe it. How could something so real just not be there? I started to wonder if the house was messing with me, if maybe it was all in my head. But that night, as I lay in bed, the voice came again, louder, more insistent. Please, help me, I'm lost. It sounded like it was right outside the door. I jumped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and headed for the attic. I climbed the narrow stairs, flashlight trembling in my hand, and pushed open the attic door. The air was thick, musty, and I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. The voice was louder now, echoing in the small space, but as I swept the flashlight across the attic, nothing was there. Nothing but old boxes and dusty furniture. I stood there, confused, trying to make sense of it all. That's when I noticed something strange in the far corner. A small vent, barely noticeable, hidden behind a stack of boxes. I moved closer, shining the light inside. That's when I saw it, a small device tucked away inside the vent. It looked like a microphone. I stood there, staring at it, my mind racing. Who put this here? Why? I grabbed the device and rushed downstairs. My thoughts were spinning, trying to piece it all together. Someone had been watching us, listening to us, and somehow they were playing that voice through the house. I called the police. They came quickly, combing through the house, searching for more devices. They found several, hidden in the vents, behind the walls, even under the floorboards. Whoever had planted them had been in the house before we moved in. They had been watching us the entire time. The police traced the devices back to a man who lived nearby. He had been stalking us, using the voice of a child to manipulate us, to make us believe something supernatural was happening. It was sick, twisted, but it was real. Even after the man was arrested, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching us, that somehow he was still in the house, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. The police assured us that the devices had been removed, that we were safe now, but the damage was done. Every time the house creaked, every time the wind rustled through the trees, I couldn't help but wonder if he was still out there. Watching, listening, waiting. Sarah tried to move on, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about how easily we had been manipulated, how he had used our fears against us, turning our home into a prison of our own making. We moved out shortly after. I couldn't stay there anymore. But even now in our new house, I sometimes think I hear that voice, faint, distant, calling out for help. I tell myself it's just the wind, just the rain. But deep down, I know it's him, or someone like him. And the thought of that will always be with me. It was late October, and the rain had been relentless for days. Our neighborhood wasn't the type of place where strange things happened, but that month, everything changed. The houses were all packed close together, each one nearly identical to the next, with well-manicured lawns and picket fences. Life had always been mundane here, until a little girl went missing. Her name was Lucy, a 7-year-old who lived just a few houses down from me. One afternoon, she had been playing outside with her friends when she simply vanished. No one saw where she went, and no one heard a sound. Lucy's mother had called the police within hours, her voice shaky and desperate. By evening, the neighborhood was flooded with searchlights and officers combing through every backyard, every alleyway. Still, there was no sign of her. That night, people began whispering about the old witch. She lived in the last house on the block, a weathered old building that seemed to have aged poorly alongside its owner. Her real name was Mrs. Clemens, but most of us only knew her as the strange woman who never left her house. For years, the kids had spread stories about her being a witch. A tired cliché, but in a neighborhood like ours, rumors like that gained traction quickly. After Lucy disappeared, those whispers grew louder. People began pointing fingers, their minds connecting dots that didn't belong together. Mrs. Clemens had always kept to herself, but that didn't stop people from wondering what went on behind her closed doors. I didn't pay much attention to the gossip at first. Lucy's disappearance was heartbreaking, yes, but the idea that an old woman was somehow involved seemed absurd. Still, the more people talked, the more uneasy things felt. And then, another child went missing. His name was Daniel, and he lived right across the street from me. It had been just a week since Lucy vanished, and now Daniel was gone too. This time, the search began immediately. Neighbors poured into the streets, flashlights cutting through the misty rain as people called his name over and over. I joined the search, wandering down the block toward Mrs. Clemens' house. I wasn't sure why I ended up there, but something about her house just drew my attention that night. Her windows were dark, the curtains pulled tight. It looked no different than it usually did, but I found myself staring at the place, as though waiting for something to happen. It was then that I heard the softest sound, like children laughing. It was so faint I almost didn't catch it, but it sent a shiver down my spine. It seemed to be coming from Mrs. Clemens' yard. I stepped closer, the rain soaking through my jacket, the puddles deepening under my feet. I peered over the fence into her backyard, half expecting to see something I couldn't explain. But there was nothing there, just the overgrown grass swaying in the wind, as though the place had been abandoned for years. Still, that eerie laughter stuck with me, echoing in my mind long after I walked away. The next day, the neighborhood buzzed with talk. People were no longer just whispering about Mrs. Clemens, they were outright accusing her. I heard it at the local store, at the bus stop, even from my own friends. They were convinced she had something to do with the disappearances. It wasn't long before I started noticing the odd things myself. Every night, there was a low, distant murmur coming from her house. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but after hearing it a few nights in a row, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The neighborhood grew tense. People avoided walking near her house. Parents kept their kids inside, not letting them play in the streets anymore. The more I thought about it, the stranger things seemed. It felt as if the neighborhood was slipping into some kind of dark hysteria, and I didn't know what to believe anymore. A few more days passed, and I couldn't take it anymore. Curiosity, mixed with an underlying sense of dread, pushed me to do something I never thought I would. I decided to confront Mrs. Clemens. I told myself it was just to put my mind at ease, to prove to myself that she was nothing more than an old woman living alone. But deep down, I was nervous. Something about this didn't feel right. The rain poured harder that evening as I walked toward her house. I knocked on her door, the sound barely audible over the storm. To my surprise, she opened it almost immediately, her face half hidden in shadow. She didn't seem surprised to see me. In fact, she smiled, though it was a cold, distant sort of smile. Without saying a word, she stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped through the doorway. The house was dimly lit, and the air smelled stale, like a place that hadn't been opened to fresh air in years. The furniture was old, worn. I saw stacks of books lining the walls, thick tomes that looked ancient and unused. "Tea?" she asked, her voice softer than I expected. I declined, glancing around the room, my eyes drawn to the strange decorations she had. Old, dusty toys were scattered across a table, and on one wall there were children's drawings pinned up. Something about it felt wrong, out of place. "Is there something you wanted to ask me?" Mrs. Clemens finally spoke, her tone neutral, but her eyes seemed to study me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I didn't know what to say. All the rumors, the disappearances, the accusations. It suddenly felt ridiculous to say any of it aloud. I stammered something about just checking in on her, then quickly made an excuse to leave. As I turned to go, I glanced toward the back of her house. Down the hallway, I saw a door that looked far newer than the rest of the house. It was locked. I couldn't get that locked door out of my mind. Why would an old woman living alone have a brand new locked door in her house? Something didn't add up, and I was determined to find out why. The next day, I made a plan. I waited until she left her house. She rarely went out, but that afternoon, I saw her walk down the street with an umbrella in hand. The rain had let up for a bit, and I knew this was my chance. I snuck into her backyard, my heart pounding as I approached the back window. It wasn't hard to pry it open. After all, the house was old, and the locks were rusted. I climbed inside, trying to keep quiet. The house was even creepier in the daylight. Everything felt wrong. It wasn't just the old toys and drawings. It was the overwhelming sense that this place hadn't seen real life in decades. Yet those new locks on the door suggested otherwise. I made my way to the hallway, my eyes fixed on that new door. With a bit of force, I managed to break the lock and push it open. What I saw inside made my stomach turn. The room was small, barely larger than a closet, but it was filled with evidence. Evidence that pointed to something far darker than witchcraft. There were photos of children, stacks of documents, and worst of all, a map of the neighborhood with red circles drawn around certain houses. Lucy's and Daniel's houses were both marked. This wasn't the home of a witch. This was something far more terrifying. It was a setup, a carefully crafted illusion to make it look like Mrs. Clemens was involved in something sinister, while the real culprits operated in the shadows. As I pieced it together, the realization hit me hard. This was a trafficking operation, a network of predators using the old woman as a scapegoat, framing her for their own crimes. The strange noises, the children's laughter at night, it was all part of their cover. They had been working in plain sight, and no one had suspected them, because we were all too focused on the idea of a witch. I went straight to the police with what I found. I told them everything, from the rumors about Mrs. Clemens to the hidden room filled with evidence. But no one took me seriously. They dismissed it, saying it was just the ravings of someone who had gotten caught up in the hysteria. They said the documents I found were probably just old case files from her time as a child psychologist. And the map was a coincidence. It was infuriating, but I couldn't let it go. I kept digging, trying to find any other clues that might expose the truth. I stayed up late, researching trafficking rings, reading up on how they operated. Then one night, I heard it again. That same eerie laughter outside my window. This time, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I ran outside, and there, in the shadows near the edge of the street, I saw them. Two figures slipping into the dark, moving too quickly for me to follow. I knew then that the operation was still active, that the real predators were still out there, hiding in plain sight, using our fear of the supernatural to keep us distracted. Mrs. Clemens was just a pawn in their game. She moved away not long after, her reputation ruined. The neighborhood went back to normal, but I could never forget what I had uncovered. Even now, I hear those faint sounds late at night. And every time, I wonder if another child has gone missing, if the darkness is still creeping through the streets, unnoticed by everyone but me.